Here we are live on Philosophy for the People with our friend Gil Sanders has returned. In fact, it's been a while, Gil. There he is. He's right there. He's right there.
Right.
That's Gil. And it's great to have you back on the channel. In fact, I think the last time you were on, it was before we even started the Philosophy for the People channel. I think it was my original Pat Flynn show. So it has been a minute, my friend. And we're going to talk about moral realism. And you've been doing a lot of research on this in defense of moral realism. So we thought it'd be cool to have you on and share some of the recent research you've been doing on the subject. It's an important one. It's certainly a relevant one. So welcome back to the channel, Gil. Thanks for being here.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on here, guys. So so just going on moral realism. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar, but the moral realism debate, I think, has been increasing lately. I think especially on my Facebook, if it's any good judgment. I have a few people who are actually questioning it. You have David Palman, who is actually a Christian philosopher who is adopting or has at least moral anti-realist sentiments. And I've seen people like Lance Bush who are kind of raising questions and creating philosophical arguments against realism. You also have on YouTube channels.
Got to watch out for those YouTube channels, my friend.
Yes. Oh yeah.
They could be nasty.
You definitely do. So it's like. And it's an interesting challenge, I think as far as objective moral values goes, that seems pretty fundamental to human society and human interaction.
Yeah. So let's, if you don't mind, Gil, I'd like to just throw out some initial stage setting and then let you maybe fill in the details and comment on it. But what for people who are maybe new to this, because we don't like to make too many assumptions on this channel. Sometimes we dive right into the deep end of the pool, and I have to remember. Well, let's go back. There might be some people who are just dipping their toe in. Moral realism is to the commitment to, as you said, that there are objective moral facts, right? That moral claims are susceptible to being either true or false. Now, it's important to understand that moral realists, even though they are against, say, non-cognitivists, that would be a camp of philosophers who think that moral claims are not susceptible to truth or falsity at all, right? And they're certainly against other error theorists, right, who say that people who make moral claims think they're reporting something that's true, but in fact it's just all false, and they give some sort of story of why that is, some sort of debunking argument. I'm sure we'll get into that, right? But moral realists, while they are committed in opposition to those camps, very widely in their actual commitments in terms of moral theory, like what grounds moral facts? Is it a realm of Platonic forms? Or is it essentialism? Is it divine commands, right? And they also disagree on what the moral facts actually are, right? So I just want to make that clear that the defense of moral realism is not necessarily a commitment to any particular moral theory that a moral realist might advance. Now, Gil, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but I do believe that you are probably going to advance something of a Thomistic version of this, right? At some point. Yeah. Definitely. So sorry, I just wanted to throw those first few thoughts out there, but please fill in any details and further thoughts that you have. Yep.
Yeah. My central thesis I would be making a Thomistic, common sense approach to moral realism, or defense of moral realism, rather. And I think that's very important, just because I think your metaphysics determines your ethics. I think that should be the metaphysical, I guess, logical priority, you might say. It shouldn't be that I have my ethics or I just kind of choose my ethics in some buffet kind of manner, and my metaphysics in some buffet manner. It's rather that in order to have a consistent, unified, beautiful system, we need to have it so that it works together, that they work together and they imply or entail each other. And I do strongly believe that Thomism particularly makes the most sense of ethics. Right. Especially of how we in real life approach it. And it takes different ways. And, I think it incorporates different ways of even thinking about that. Different moral theories, you might say, like duties, deontology. If you don't know anything, that's Kant's view of ethics. Right. But it's all about duties. Or utilitarianism, where we seem to, at least in some of our moral calculus, we seem to consider the consequences of our actions to some extent. And to what extent is that, And so it looks as if, there are things that are intrinsically immoral. There are things that maybe depend on some extrinsic circumstances. And then also virtue ethics as well, where Aristotle talks about character and how important that is. So I think Thomism provides the best of all three worlds in this unified system of thought. And so I really think it provides, something that's lacking, today, especially in terms of like what you were talking about earlier about grounding, metaphysical grounding.
Right.
I notice a lot of these ethical theories don't have that metaphysical grounding, or just simply take it for granted that these values or intrinsic rights, what have you, exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to be defending that Thomistic case.
Yeah, that's excellent. And certainly I've announced many times before that so much of what attracts me to Thomism is its systematic unity, right? How the metaphysics informs the ethics, informs the philosophical anthropology. It all hangs together in this beautiful web, this beautiful normative web, actually.
Exactly.
And I find that lacking in many other systems, or at least incomplete, right? Because, to me, Thomism is clearly an outgrowth and extension of prior thinkers like Aristotle and stuff like that, right? So, yeah, awesome, Gil. Well, why don't you... start us off then. I know you want to first give a defense of moral realism, so I'm going to let you lead the conversation here, and I'll just chime in whenever it makes sense to do so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. All right. So one thing I kind of preface this before I really get into the nitty-gritty of this is to simply say that I don't want to make it seem as if there's a knockdown, maybe QED argument. I think what's better is that as you do philosophy, you see that moral realism is true. As you do metaphysics, you see Thomism is true. I don't want to make it seem as if there's one knockdown argument. And then you're just going to be like, okay, you're a moral realist now.
Right.
And I think it's important to note that, just because we do want to exercise intellectual humility, but that does not exclude confidence. So I'm quite confident that moral realism is true. There's just like no doubt in my mind that it's true. Nevertheless, I do think that we do need to recognize the limitations of certain arguments and know how far they take us. And so what I'll be doing here is just kind of giving a brief sketch of those arguments and kind of like doing a little bit of metaphysics, natural theology, and a little bit of maybe epistemology in the process to provide a case for moral realism. So we're gonna get into that. We can provide some arguments, and so we'll get into that. But I want to first kind of address the question: well, why does this matter? So again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier when I was saying about Facebook and my interactions there. It seems like Lance Bush. We have a YouTuber named Kane B. Is producing videos. I'm not sure if on YouTube, if you guys ever seen. He's a pretty smart philosopher, but he produces videos defending moral anti-realism. And then I recently have been discussing it with a friend of mine, Jordan Simmons, who's an agnostic philosopher, which is interesting because he takes a more realist approach and he defends that, but from a more subjectivist point of view. We'll get into that very much today, but I'm just surrounded by people who are thinking these things. I think it's very crucial to think about this. Like, is it really possible to be a Christian and to be a more anti-realist at the same time?
Okay, that's interesting, right? And that is different, right? That is different than wanting to defend moral realism. That's entire, but that's an important question as well, and certainly one that I think would be fun to consider. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there are some things that I would give them credit for these more anti-realists. I do think they have a sense in which a lot of moral realist arguments seem to be weak, as far as like analytic modern philosophers and their defense of why is moral realism true. It seems to be just a mere, just like, oh, I feel that way, perhaps. And so I think we need a better kind of like stronger case. And I think Thomism provides that case. I think, in fact, provides the best case for what we should think.
Right. Yeah. In a lot of modern literature, you get appeals to intuition and stuff like that. And that can get quite sophisticated of why that, should be taken as generally reliable as a general rule of thumb. But you're right. If that was the only case that could be made, I'd feel a little less confident in moral realism than I currently do. Yeah.
Yes, same. And the intuitions do have their place. I don't think we should dismiss them, but I do think that if we can go beyond them, we should. If we can kind of like provide additional arguments and reasons why we believe the way they do. So I just want to be able to take those arguments seriously, but remaining true to our, I guess, common sense convictions, I would say, as Aristotle did when he was addressing Parmenides. Right. I think Parmenides was kind of arguing why change is an illusion. There's no change. It's just absolute being. But I think even if all of us were unable to respond to that argument or Zenos's paradoxes, we would still be unpersuaded because our common sense is so compelling.
So strong, right? We seem to have this extremely strong intuition of like we encounter some, the arguments from Parmenides, and they're like, that seems like a good argument, but there's got to be something wrong with it, right? Yeah, exactly. And Aristotle said that, right? But he also explained what was wrong with it, right? Yes. And I certainly want to affirm that what you're saying is definitely the case about moral realism. In fact, there's people who defend moral realism with like really just that basic assertion of like whatever arguments you could give against moral realism are always going to be less obvious than the profound intuition that moral realism is true. Now, that's something. Like that's something in favor of it, but you're right. We want to go further than that. Totally.
Yeah. Yep. And so that's what I'll be providing that common sense case as well, and defending common sense against maybe some objections later on. But yeah.
Well, let me point out as well that like it should be not controversial at all to say that the common sense position is obviously moral realism. We all live our lives, right, as if there really are moral facts, right? We're constantly making moral judgments. I mean, just look at the nature of politics, right? It's suffused with moral language, right? And oftentimes it's people who would probably, in philosophical conversation deny moral realism who make some of the strongest moral judgments in the political realm as well. So like at the very least, you almost always have these sort of performative contradictions where what somebody might say is their philosophical position is quite inconsistent with how they live their lives and how they engage politics and society at large and stuff like that. So it really is hard to get around the fact that this really is our operative perspective in life, right? Even though we disagree about moral facts, virtually everybody is an operative moral realist, right?
I would agree. I think like David Enoch has a post as an article on that, and why you're an objectivist about moral values. And so he kind of makes the same point, similar to that. And I think there's a certain cognitive dissonance, I think, for most people. You may, in some rare cases, maybe have some individuals perfectly consistent with ideas. I've seen maybe one or two who are like that. But
really, that's impressive. It's been hard for me to imagine like what a consistent relativist or nihilistic like existence would even be like, right? Because you even have, I don't want to get too far ahead, but of course you have normativity even in the realm of rationality. Like for me, morality and rationality are deeply intertwined. You really can't start to break one without ultimately breaking another, if you know what I mean. And that's one of the strongest motivations for me for moral realism is that strong, just normative web through this entire structure of reality down to rationality itself. But again, I might be getting ahead of myself at this point.
Oh no, we can get into that. It has to do with the human's view of the passions and the will in relation to some, at least for some more anti-realists, that is. They will say that the passions oversee the reason. So that'll be part of it. What we get into.
But if anybody out there actually knows like a legit, like consistent nihilist, like please. Send me their profile on Facebook. I would love to observe them for a few days. But anyways, Gil, please take back over.
For sure. At least they try to be consistent, by the way, I'd say. But okay. So what I'll do here, I just kind of want to give you guys like an overview of the field of what we're going to be talking about before I get into the actual arguments. It's pretty important. It's pretty heavy laden with terminology that some people may not be familiar with.
People can pull up the old Stanford encyclopedia if they need.
That's true. So I'll do my best just to kind of go through them as quickly as I can. And if you have any questions, you can just comment in the section or it's research on the encyclopedia, like Matt's saying here. So first thing about we're basically what we're talking about here is a field called metaethics. This is something we're talking about, the big questions of ethics, the biggest, where does morality come from, and all that. So before I get into that, let's start with what we know and then go more into the unknown, as Aristotle's methodology is, which I really like to do when explaining things to people. So we all know what ethics is. Ethics is just simply the study about what is right and wrong, what we ought to do, what our moral obligations are, what intrinsic rights they are, if we have any intrinsic value, rather. So what we ought to do, these are called in philosophy moral norms, or just norms, things that we ought to do, normative claims. So that leads
for Aristotle, practical. Aristotle uses the term practical. You also find injunctions. These are all often used interchangeably, right?
Yep, exactly. So norms are pretty important in philosophy. So that leads about, you might say, some branches of ethics. So one branch would be normative ethics. So that just examines and develops rules and principles that guide our behavior. So it basically develops a general moral theory. But what theory should I say about how we should act and principles that we should guide our behavior? So that's normative ethics. It's talking directly about, what we should do. Then you have applied ethics, where it applies these theories, you might say, from normative ethics to real situations.
Right, like medical cases, for example.
Correct. Euthanasia, abortion, veganism, very concrete, like political cases, political situations. How do we address these situations in real life and as a person, as a human being, rather than simply in the abstract? So that's applied ethics. So we have normative and applied ethics. The other field would be metaethics, which I kind of briefly explained explained already, but it basically just asks questions like, what is the meaning of moral statements? Do they mean anything, if anything at all? How do we know that? Can moral statements be true or false? Are there objective, true moral facts? And is morality kind of universal? Is it relative? So that's metaethics. And so you could think about metaethics as talking about morality itself, whereas normative and applied ethics works within the domain of morality. Mm-hmm. So maybe an analogy that might be helpful would be like, it's a difference between, like, say, operating inside a mall versus building or destroying the mall itself, right? So metaethics is about morality itself. Normative and applied ethics works within that domain of morality. So just to kind of maybe help clarify that for you guys.
Yeah, that is helpful indeed. Thank you, Gil. Mm-hmm.
So that leads to, I think, metaethics, because that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And so there are different metaethical positions that you find. So one of the first fundamental questions that we can ask is, well, are the moral claims capable of being true or false? Are they at least capable? And maybe they're not actually true or false, but are they at least capable? And usually if you say in the affirmative, you say, yeah, I'm a cognitivist. I say, yes, I believe moral claims when we make moral statements that they say something about something that's either true or false. Right. That's the nature of moral statements.
Which means they're susceptible to the realm of knowledge, right?
Correct. Yeah. And it's not something else. So where alternatively, you might say non-cognitivist. There's different forms of non-cognitivist, but you might say one of the most popular or well-known ones is emotivism. It's simply basically the view that moral statements don't express anything true or false about anything. They simply express emotional attitudes. So when you reflect on abortion, you're not like, oh, this is why I disagree with abortion. I have an intellectual, rational reason. Rather, just like, boo, abortion, boo. Right. It just makes me feel mad or feel angry, or it makes me feel good. It's like, yeah, abortion, yay, So those are simply expressions of emotional attitudes. So these moral statements, or moral statements that we make, ultimately don't report on anything. So they're not like a journalist reporting on like what happened in this particular event, and then it's either true or false, whether it happened or not. No, it's not reporting on any moral facts or moral domain. It's simply expressing one's emotions. It's like, ouch. You don't tell someone, oh, that's true, man. No, it's just, you could turn it into a true statement. It's like, it is true that I experienced pain.
Gil said ouch or experienced pain, right? Yeah, but
right. And you turned it into a report then in that case. You reported something about yourself. But when it comes to emotional attitudes themselves, without that, I guess you could say translation into a report, it's just an emotional attitude. It's an emotional expression. It has no true or falseness to it. Or I say, wow. It's like, man, that's a false statement you just made there, Gil. It's like, what? There's no true value to that, So that is emotivism, is that these moral statements don't have true value. Alternative is also not.
I was just going to reiterate that non-cognitivists are going to say generally that whatever else morality is, it's not something that belongs in the domain of knowledge, for example.
Correct. Right. And there's another form of non-cognitivism, what we call prescriptivism. So it's basically like emotivism, but it's simply the idea that moral statements express commands. Don't do it. Don't do that. Stop it. Or do it right now. Things like that are just commands. They're not really kind of telling you anything true or false still. They're just telling you expressions of commands.
Right.
And so that's another form. It's very similar to emotivism, just about commands. And then you also have quasi-realism. And so that's basically just moral. It's complicated, but the basic idea is that we act as if moral values are true. And so moral statements project emotional attitudes as though they were real properties. They're not real properties though, but we engage in them so that they don't have actually real true value. It's a project that we do, kind of like a moment, kind of like a fiction maybe in some ways, but we act as if they're moral, but they're not really saying anything true. It's a game, a truth or false game, but it's not really actually something that's susceptible to truth or false evaluations.
Right.
So that's quasi-realism. Now, I think I'm not going to get into why I believe any of this, but I am a cognitivist. Obviously, I do believe most statements express true value statements. So given that, if cognitivism is true, are at least some moral claims true? This is a separate question now. Now that we've asked the first question, are moral claims capable of being true or false? Now you have to ask the question, are at least some of those moral claims actually true? or are they actually false, or at least some of those? Now, the answer would be someone who thinks that they're all false would actually be error theory. It's called error theory, where we just all of our moral statements are reflecting something. They're saying something true or false, but we think it's true, but in fact, in reality, it's actually false. So that's a form of like nihilism. And so Mackey is pretty well known for advancing this view.
Right. Yep.
All moral statements are false.
Yeah. Inventing ethics would be the quintessential text there. Right.
Yeah. And to briefly explain why, you might say that that's weird, but he thinks moral values are just very queer things. They're very
right.
You know? Yeah.
And from a certain, I would say, impoverished metaphysical paradigm, they are. He's right.
Exactly. When you rob the world of devoid of any value, particles in motion that have no value, then of course, like, how are you going to derive value from that? Because Mackey's like, there are no moral values in the world, so there's nothing in the world to correspond with our statements. Because if you take the correspondence theory of truth, which is that in order for something to be true, it has to correspond to something in reality, then what are moral facts corresponding to? They're not. They're like unicorns to him. You could say unicorns exist, but that would be false because there are no unicorns in reality.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a good general point. Is like a number of people who might be skeptical of moral realism or might adopt an error theory might actually be like generally on board with, say, the correspondence theory of truth, which of course traces back to Aristotle. But their general metaphysics and ontology is going to be so impoverished compared to Aristotle, right? That what you can possibly range over with the correspondence theory isn't going to pick up what needs to be there to ground moral facts and moral truths, if that makes sense, right? Which for Aristotle, again, not to get too ahead of people here, is like it's going to be grounded in right desire, and right desire is going to be grounded in facts about human nature, right? But in a metaphysics that like somebody like Mackey's dealing with, you're just not going to have that that structure there, right? But I just wanted to point out that like their general theory of truth itself might actually be they might not actually be a disagreement there. It's just in the application of it and the greater background metaphysics, which I think is just an important thing to highlight.
Yeah, it's very important. That's why metaphysics is so important. It's because your worldview is going to influence how you think of certain things that you would otherwise take as facts, like morality, values, So that's why Mackey's coming from that view. He's not, as far as I know, he's still not a theist. So that's part of the problem, I think.
Right.
And another one that might be interesting.
And let me also just highlight, because you brought up that he's not a theist, which he wasn't, right? And he's deceased, God rest him. But obviously, I just want to highlight up front, not all moral realists are theists. There are many atheistic and agnostic moral realists out there. So this is not a debate that just divides theists and atheists and agnostics, right? And as you said, there's Christians who are moral anti-realists, right? Yeah, so exactly. Clearly this is not now, of course, I think you'll be more likely to find nihilists on the atheistic side and moral realists on the Christian and religious side. Definitely. But it's not, it doesn't cut that neatly is what I'm saying, right?
Correct. Yeah, I totally agree. So, yeah. And so then going back again to like, okay, are some moral claims true? We have error theory. It says in the negative, no, all moral claims are false. There's another maybe more nuanced view, you might say, depending on what perspective you're coming from. But like fictionalism, it's basically kind of like error theory. It's basically saying, yeah, it's true in a sense that objectively there are no like moral facts or moral claims, but that are true. But it will say, but there's still moral facts in the sense that, it's true within a story. Kind of like you have like facts about Lord of the Rings. Which is my favorite, story of all time.
It's a good one.
Besides Christianity.
The Hobbit, anyways. I never made it out of the Shire in Lord of the Rings, so I can't really speak about that.
Okay. Yeah. But I do think you can say things that are true about that story. Within the story itself, anyways, you could say that Aragorn is of this particular age, You can say that this happened in Lord of the Rings or in Harry Potter, whatever you might say. And so it's still some true, but it's still a fictional truth, you might say, right? And so it's not true objectively or of the world. It's simply true of certain fiction that we create. Yeah. And so someone might say that. It's like, yeah, that can explain a little bit of what we see about moral talk and moral experience. Because in everyday moral experience, we act as if there are such things as moral facts. And why is that? And so the fictionalist tries to explain that. And so that would be the fictionalist view. But at least for us, we're cognitivists. So most cognitivists will say, yes, of course, at least some moral claims are true.
Yeah.
So that would be the position I would be advancing as well here.
Groovy.
So yeah. And after that, then we might say the next natural question, because again, when we remember this, remind you guys, we're talking about metaethical positions. So I'm kind of going through this logical kind of like hierarchy, you might say, or logical progression of thought, so you can see where things are and what the field's like here. So next question after that is like, if some moral claims are true, that leads us to another question. Are these moral claims true objectively or subjectively, right? So what do we mean by objective then? So I think by objective, we mean the truth of a statement does not depend on a mind to be true, but it's true by virtue of something in reality. In other words, it stands independent. It's another way to put it. You probably hear that a lot in metaethics. It stands independent.
Yeah, it's extra mental, extra linguistic, right? It's grounded in something other than our way of thinking or talking about it.
Correct, yeah. It's true irrespective of what a person happens to believe, feel, or desire. It's independent of their particular stances.
Right. To just make it concrete, we're saying that rape is, if you're taking the objective stance, you're not saying that rape is wrong just because you think it is wrong or you feel it is wrong, right? There's something out there beyond your thinking and feeling about it that grounds that moral fact, right?
Correct. Yep. And that's in contrast to say something subjective. It's if the truth of a statement depends on someone else's beliefs, preferences, goals, or desires, that makes it stance dependent. The moral facts are actually stance dependent. They depend on what you feel about it, what you think about it, what your goals or intended desires might be, so those things are just subjective. And so again, the question is, are these moral claims objective or subjective? And so the subjectivist is obviously going to answer, well, no, it depends. There are different versions of subjectivism, mind you, but it depends on culture or individuals. So they might say something like, well, it's a matter of like empirical facts and consistency of a culture's like fundamental values. If you're like, if you think it's relative to culture or subjective about culture, the culture determines more values. Then you might say, well, yeah, how we determine whether something's right or wrong is going to depend on whether we can make empirical facts about how that society in general thinks about something. And then are they being consistent with those fundamental values that they happen to believe in? So for example, like you might go to a country where they believe very much in liberty, the pursuit of happiness, you might say. And then, but then they might also be anti same-sex marriage. Someone might say that someone who's a cultural subjectivist would say, well, hey, what's going on here? Because they'll say that's wrong, even relative to that society, because, they're being inconsistent with their fundamental values, which is liberty. Why are you robbing, homosexuals of their liberty? That'll be a typical example that they might argue from. So they'll say you can still reason through things. You can still have reasonable, engage in rational discourse about moral facts and moral values, but they are subjective still. And so that would be kind of a way in which they might assess that, or we could assess other cultures that are outside of our own in virtue of their own values and kind of evaluate their consistency relations. So that's like how a subjectivist, a more sophisticated subjectivist would argue.
Right. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah. So, and then these are a question of what's the difference? This is a more technical thing, but I think it's important to kind of like elaborate on what's the difference between relativism and subjectivism, right? And so I think relativism, like there are multiple standards by which one can evaluate something under relativism. So one could be relative in an objective way. So for example, it's objectively true that relative to the sun, the Earth is small, pretty small, right? Relative to the sun. So there's an objective kind of relation there. We can say something like tallness, I am objectively taller than my baby sister, right? There's that certain objective relativity there. So not all relativity is actually subjective. That might be a little bit counterintuitive. Some people who are used to thinking of relativism as completely subjective. But I think it's important to note that because it's going to be important.
I often say that Aristotle's theory is an objective relativity or a relative objectivity, depending on how you want to look at it, right? Because there are going to be objective moral facts of the matter that are often relevant to an individual, the circumstances, the intentions, and all that sort of stuff, right? Well, so I'm glad you just brought that point up.
Yeah, it's really important. So some people misunderstand there. So it could be relative in a subjective way, though. It could be relative to culture or the individual, like we were talking about moral beliefs. Well, in my opinion, I feel that abortion is right, and then the person's like, well, in my opinion, I feel that abortion is wrong. It's relative to their feelings, but it's objective, and there's only one sense that's objective, is that if you're reporting on their emotions or their state of mind and their beliefs, it's objective. Like it's objectively true that I feel
they feel that way. That's right.
I feel that way, or I believe that way. But nevertheless, it doesn't reflect anything objective about reality necessarily. Whereas something about like the sun relative to the moon, or the earth, it's bigger.
And it might be objectively true that Gil feels that eating blueberry yogurt is morally wrong, but that doesn't mean that eating blueberry yogurt actually is morally wrong, right?
Correct. Yep. Exactly. So that's pretty important. So like it's really important to note that relativism does not entail at least subjectivism, or vice versa. So Chris, for example, you can actually have non-relativist subjectivism. Like you could have like ideal observer theory. But anyways, I don't want to get into that right now. We'll get into that in just a
As
second,
always, there's camps within camps within camps within camps, right? And it's like somebody goes to the soda machine and just dumps every single one into a cup and tries to mix it around, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Some of them make sense, some of them don't. But I think you've given us a good lay of the land so far, right? Yeah.
Yep. And so that is, so those are all the subjectivist, relativist views. You might say objective, subjective. So now, again, returning to that question, are moral claims objective or subjective? Well, typically, I think as moral realists, we will say that's subjective. That's the moral realist position, is that minimally, I'm going to give a minimal definition of moral realism, is the belief that there are objective moral facts. It's a metaphysical thesis. Moral statements correspond to some mind-independent feature of reality. There's some controversy, again, like some people have redefinitions about what we mean by objective here. What are these objective moral facts? But I think minimally, we can say that they're not the product of like human convention, or are more robust than the norms of like etiquette or civil law or like chess, certain games. Like, there's certain truths in which like, you objectively have to play the game in a certain way, this way, maybe perhaps relative to human standards, how we play the game. But, that's not the kind of objectivity the moral realists are talking about. Civil law, like getting a ticket or something, getting a speeding ticket.
Right, or individual preferences for blueberry versus raspberry yogurt, stuff like that. Right.
Correct. So whatever we kind of like, however we try to explain objective, it's going to be something more robust than that, something more like attaching more to reality than simply some civil law, human construct, or human standard. So that's important to know. And I want to do that. I want to make a minimal definition of moral realism just because it's important to kind of like capture all the complexity and nuance that there might be in this particular debate. And so, so that's moral realism is just simply the idea. If you want to sum it up in a simple way, they're objective. There are objective moral facts. And some of them, at least some of them, are true. So we might say like there are different forms of realism though too. I should clarify on that too as well, because you were hinting on this as well earlier. But there's a naturalist view of moral facts. We might say, well, there are moral facts, but those moral facts just depend on some way on the natural world. However, we may want to explain that in some way. It might be someone might say, oh, it has to be empirical. It has to be grounded in some of the sciences, perhaps. Or you may take a more Aristotelian kind of understanding of nature. And so, however, in some way, it depends on the natural world. That's more of a naturalist view of moral realism. And then you have the non-naturalist view, which is simply like, well, it's a negative thesis. It simply says they do not depend on a natural world. They could depend on maybe some abstract objects, maybe something immaterial, whatever kind of construction you may have, some unreason, if you adopt Kant's view, it's a rational construct. So there's different ways to explain moral realism. So we have these different theories, and so it's important to kind of distinguish those because I am a Thomist, so I would identify as a naturalist of sorts. Naturalism is a very tricky thing to define, though, in analytic philosophy.
A naturalism that's obviously compatible with a theism, right? Which is not normally how the term is used. Or
exactly, we're not advocating any kind of atheism necessarily here. So, that's important to note here. In metaethics can slightly confusing sometimes because it uses, I guess, terms in an unconventional way or a non-standard way than other fields.
Which happens in philosophy all the time, right? So you always have to be careful about that, right? If somebody's using the term naturalist in ethics, do they mean the same thing there as somebody who's in philosophy of religion, for example, right? Maybe not. So be careful about that, right?
Yep, exactly. So then the next question may be, now that you have moral realism, again, you might say, what are moral facts? And I want to make two distinctions between two different types of moral facts.
Mhm.
And I'm making this complicated, I know, but I just want to get
No,
you
this
guys.
is all good background
Yeah.
stage setting, and
Yeah.
conversations like this, Gil, you want to be careful and you want to be patient if you just rush into
Mhm.
things, and you'll probably have to come back to all this stuff anyways, right? Once the debate
Correct.
starts. So my
Yeah.
policy is like, yep, let's just be careful, just work our way through, and hopefully it'll actually be more efficient that way ultimately, right?
Right. Okay.
So you're doing great, man. Keep at it. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Just bear with me here. So, it should be a really good discussion. So, but anyways, I kind of want to talk about these two distinct kinds of moral facts. They're axiological facts and what we call normative facts. So, in other words, statements of value versus what you should do, as we talked about normative facts before. So, let me get into that axiological moral facts a little more. So, axiological moral facts, they concern value. So something is good in itself. It's intrinsically good, you might say, as opposed to good only as a means to an end. That's an extrinsic good. So examples in which we talk about axiological moral facts would be like humans have value. Humans have infinite worth. They're worth something. Love is good. Hatred is bad. You're making statements of value about these things, not necessarily about actions, because we're not talking about actions. We're just making value statements about things or about certain properties or feelings, perhaps, and attitudes. So these are evaluations that we attach to certain things, to certain attitudes. Whereas normative moral facts, they concern how we ought to act, feel, or think, right? You ought not to murder is one clear example. Oughtness, it's about what is normal, what we should do, what the norms are for us to abide by. And so that's very important too. And so these two things, just kind of keep it in the background that these are two distinct things. They're highly interrelated, they're interdependent, I would say, obviously, but they're still distinct.
Right.
And so it's important to have that distinction in mind as we go about this. And now, obviously, I cannot talk about normative moral facts without even talking about Kant's famous distinction between hypothetical, categories and hypothetical norms versus categorical norms. Those are two important distinctions as well to make, because this is going to come up in discussion as well. So what are hypothetical norms? Well, hypothetical norms are what you ought to do, but they're hypothetical in the sense that the ought depends on what your desires or ends are, what your purposes are. So if I want to be strong and built, if I want to get ripped, then I ought to do a kettlebell program with Fat Flynn or something, or I ought to do this particular workout program.
Right. If you want a rotisserie chicken for those gains at a reasonable price, you ought to shop at Costco.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. So some tips right there. So this ought is just dependent though on what what you want though. Not everybody is going to be obligated the same way. If I want to be a fireman, I ought to do this and take these course of action. So it depends on your desires and your ends. Whereas something like a categorical norm is that it would say that the ought is not dependent on your desires or ends. It's absolute for all agents, right? We are obligated to obey these norms regardless of our ends or desires. So maybe like someone who's a rapist, for example, has the obviously desire to rape somebody, has that desire, but he ought not to act on that desire. He ought not to even have that desire, even more so. And so it's independent of whatever ends or conditions you may have. It's something that applies, I guess, universally, regardless of our state, our stances. Right. So that would be like a categorical norm. And this was kind of like a famous Kantian distinction.
Yes. Yeah. So think like it hypothetical. If you want some outcome, then do this. Categorical, do this, period. Right. Exactly. Or don't do this, period. Right. Yeah. Correct. Again, what grounds that? Different question. Kant, of course, is his famous deontology, but I'm glad you brought that up because that is an important thing for people to be aware of. Yeah, very good, Gil.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, and then so I guess to kind of wrap this up in a way, I think moral realists must affirm that at least some normative moral facts are categorical norms. At least some of them. You shouldn't rape somebody, or torture somebody for fun. There are at least some categorical norms in that we should obey. And I think they should affirm that at least some value is objective, intrinsic, and irreducible. Because if you're just reducible to, like, say, a clump of cells or a clump of particles, then you actually intrinsically don't really have value. You just have value in virtue of whether you believe you do or in virtue of whether someone else believes you do. And so that's not the kind of value that we would have as more, at least not conception of value that we would have as more realists. is that we want to affirm that we all have inherent dignity as human beings made, especially in the image of God, and that image is very important, and that carries with us this idea that's irreducible. So we need to uphold that as more realists. But however, I think it might be surprising, but you do not need to affirm, at least as a moral realist, that some moral facts are accessible to us. And some people who might be like, well, yes, I believe there are more facts, but I simply don't think that they're accessible. We can't really know for sure.
Moral facts, yes. Moral knowledge, no. Right.
Yeah, right, exactly. Can we actually have knowledge of them? They exist, but we just don't know. So they might be like the example, like, well, I don't know if like there's this planet X exists like, I don't know, 10 billion miles away because I don't have access to it. Maybe in principle, might even never have access to it because it's a special planet. But nevertheless, you might say, yeah, it could still exist. It could still really be there. You could even affirm that it exists because of some effect that it might have where you think it makes best sense, but you really don't feel like you actually have knowledge of it. Some people may have higher standards of knowledge. So it depends on your epistemology there. But that's just an important caveat there. So now that kind of brushed through more realism, I don't want to get into more anti-realism, but before I do that, I just want to give it over to Pat, see if he wants to add anything to what we just said here.
Not much, man. I think that was some awesome stage setting. Yeah, let me think. Nope, we're good. Continue.
Okay. All right. So let's go into the moral anti-realist. Like, what does that mean? How do we define that? Obviously, we might say moral anti-realist is someone who's not a moral realist, right? And that's true. I think we can get a little bit more detailed on that and simply say that a moral anti-realist is someone who just simply denies that there are any objective moral facts or stance-independent facts, rather, of morality. And so this actually can take on different forms, though. It can take on a different form as error theory. You can be a non-cognitivist. You can be a subjectivist. You can be maybe agnostic about it. He's just like, I don't know what theory I can use to explain moral talk or moral experience, but at the very least, I know that moral realism is not a good theory. Or I could simply say I don't think it has any good evidence, for it's being true. So you can be agnostic, or you can be a quietist, perhaps. You can take different views as a more anti-realist. And so I think we got to be careful there to recognize that, because I noticed that some people can be inclined to simply say more anti-realist is simply subjectivist. And I'm like, well, not necessarily. You have to really consider their particular nuanced view on that. And so a lot of times, we need to make sure that that's clear. And then some common misconceptions, because I do want to be fair to more anti-realist. And I do want to say again, more anti-realism is not identical to relativism or subjectivism. That's just one form of anti-realism. But at minimum, anti-realism is just the denial that there are stance-independent facts. Second thing I might say is a common misconception. You might say that moral realists can, in a sense, affirm that there are more facts, depending on what kind of moral realist you are. It may sound confusing, but they could say something like, a good analogy that was given to me was, it's a moral fact. Well, it's a fact that if you go past the speeding limit, you'll get a ticket, right? It's a fact that will occur to you if you go past the speeding limit. That happens all the time and where I am at. We got a lot of racers here. So it's kind of cool at the same time. But, we, even though it's a human convention, even though there's no objective speed law limit that exists in some Platonic world, or, some stance independent speed limit rule, which all, countries and nations should abide by.
Hey, careful, man. There might be some extreme realists out there who are going to get upset by that.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, but typically anyways, I think most people would affirm and say, yeah, speeding, there's no, it's kind of arbitrary to simply say, it could be 61. Why couldn't it be 61? Or why couldn't the speed limit be 59? 59.5. There definitely seems to be a certain level of arbitrariness to that.
Right.
Maybe not fully, maybe not 100%, but, it seems to be a human convention at the very least. So it might take some kind of etiquette as well. To act a certain way. So more realists can still affirm that there are more facts, and they can still say, again, as the ethic fictionalist, maybe perhaps, depending what form of anti-realism they're taking, they can say, yeah, we don't deny, that this is a wrong thing to do, perhaps, given this system of thought, given this way of thinking, given these preferences or desires. Yeah, that's wrong, but it's not maybe a stance-independent kind of wrong, right? And so the more anti-realists would definitely emphasize that. Another thing they would say, some people may ask anti-realists, well, so you don't think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? What are you, some kind of sicko, some moral monster, kind of like this natural inclination might be to go into like a character attack or like, are you stupid? And I don't think that's fair. I don't think we should be attacking your character. I think we should be recognize, that this is kind of like separate them between, because a more anti-realist will say like, okay, well, look, I still hate, maybe internally, I hate rape. I hate all those things. That internally makes me, it incites disgust in me, right? And I would still hold that kind of internal disgust, regardless of whether, moral realism or anti-realism is true. I'm not going to just go ahead and start like, oh man, I'm going to go yeah, I'm going to rate people whoever I want, And he says if a more, like, I know Lance is typically, he makes these kind of arguments. And I think he makes some good points. Is that it's not as if the more anti-realist is going to go out raping or killing everybody just because he doesn't think there are objective moral values. He's just going to reinterpret values in a different way. And so I think that's very important, to recognize this, because like we can kind of jump the gun and use these questions as a way to
right, yeah, and that that's totally fair, right? And I think that's certainly right as far as it goes. At some point, I think it is legitimate to ask, like, hey, do you not think that it is a binding and universal fact that you should not rape, torture, and murder a little child, right? It is important to get somebody on the table about that, their commitment about that at some point. And I'm not saying you want to do that or you endorse that, but I just want to be clear about what your theory is actually saying, right? So I think those are important points to bring up for the sake of clarity. But like you said, you want to do it in a way that's not just trying to be like a jerk and try and suggest something to somebody that is obviously untrue, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's what I'm trying to just kind of like set the stage, because I do think those questions are legitimate and done in a particular kind of like, I don't know, when I want to use Joe Smith's way, dialectical context, I think it's important to kind of clarify that, because we're going to ask these questions like, why is it objectively wrong? Is it objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? And the anti-realist is going to be like, well, your view doesn't fare any better than mine. And in fact, it just seems as if you think you'd get away if your personal psychology is such that you would rape people if moral realism ends up being false, then there's something wrong there, not necessarily with the the metaethical position. So like, because they might argue, well, actually, I think I'm more strongly, like Lance would argue, I'm more strongly against torturing babies for fun than you are, because if you found, say, an objective fact that you ought to torture babies for fun, say it was somehow impossible in my eyes, but somehow you find an objective moral fact that you ought to murder babies for fun, would you do it, right? And he would say no, because I am still staying true to my my inner psychological tendencies, perhaps, or like whatever belief system you may subjectively have, or whatever moral construction of anti-realism you have.
Right, but notice right there, there's an assumption of a better in the background of that. Right? There's already a this is what you have to be so careful of in these types of conversations. There's more realism right in the background of that counter, right? I want people to always be aware of that. You always have to be careful of that. It sneaks back in so easily. And of course, I'm with you, Gil. There could never be a moral fact of that character, right? Given at least how we think about how moral facts are grounded. That's just metaphysically impossible, right?
Yeah,
but I just wanted to point out that it just snuck right back in,
Oh yeah, that's a good point. And I do think you have to use objective moral language as a necessity, as a part of like our common experience. I'll get into that in a bit too.
But, cool. Yeah, sorry if I'm jumping the gun.
Absolutely. No, it's totally fine. I'm happy that you are. So, as a side note, though, I think it's an interesting side note, but there's a paper by Young and Derwin. Now, I'm not sure how, I wouldn't say this is decisive evidence by any means, but I do think it provides maybe a little bit of evidence that basically the paper is titled Moral Realism as Moral Motivation. So it basically provides evidence that priming belief in moral realism actually leads to improved moral behavior. So people are more likely to donate to charity, for example, the study finds. So whether moralism is true or not seems to at least matter somewhat. It has to have some matters, has to have some consequences. That's the implication of that paper. So it's not as if I don't think, more like more realism or more anti-realism doesn't have any actual effects on society. I think it does.
Oh, yeah, of course. I completely agree with that, right? I think you'd have to be
Right.
supremely naive to suggest otherwise. And what might be the case for any individual, it's of course just way too hasty to say that that would be good for society at large, that belief system, right?
Correct. Yeah. And so, I just wanted to just kind of add that because I just thought it was an interesting side note. Now, someone might push back who's more informed of scientific literature than I am on that, but I just thought that was interesting. Now, I do want to add a potential complication to the schema that I just kind of outlined here, because there's some debate that one might have. Like, okay, what about divine command theory or ideal observer theory? Because are they forms of more anti-realism or are they forms of moral realism? So there seems to be some kind of debate on this, because some people think, well, if divine command theory is true, then it's not stance independent. It's not mind independent, because ultimately it's dependent on mind. It's God commanding things through his mind, through his intellect. So it doesn't seem to have that objectivity that we're talking about here. Or if you're an ideal observer theory, again, it's talking about some ideal observer who has all the ideal traits, about what an observer would be and objectively and all that, think things through rationally and calmly, and think things truly and have sufficient knowledge to make an informed decision or belief. So those would be like an ideal observer theory. He's someone who is the ideal man or the ideal moral agent, perhaps, as an example of how we ought to live. So, so some people might say, well, it seems to be introduced some kind of relativity, and a relativity to some mind, to some stance. And especially this discussion kind of popped up because I was kind of trying to make an argument about why Christianity, I think, requires, if not entails, more realism. And the passage in 1 John basically says about truth. If you say that I have no sin, then the truth is not in you. And I think, in my opinion, that's very clear, talking about objective truth. And talking about, in regards to what your stance is, like, no, I don't feel like I'm a sinner. It seems like the text, at least at first glance, is saying, no, it has to be objective. And people are introducing all kinds of different, exceptions to that. They're saying, well, you can be an anti-realist, like David Pellman was saying, and hold to divine command theory, something like that. You don't need to hold to a more realist account. And so this introduces kind of a complexity there, because it's kind of like, how do we think about that then? And I guess it depends on how these two views are construed, but I'm going to focus on divine command theory for now. That's what I'm most familiar with. And I would argue that, divine command theory, as usually construed anyways, is actually a form of moral realism. I don't think it's an.
And I think most divine command theorists, that's exactly what they would say. Right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a divine command theorist, at least not how it's commonly articulated.
Because the way they'd argue, and the way analogy that was given to me, again, the speeding ticket analogy, they're like, well, like, imagine God's just like this. He's like society. Society is imposing that speed limit, right? It's imposing that rule, that speed limit rule. And God's doing something through divine command theory. He's doing something very similar. He's imposing this rule on everybody else through sheer command, right? And so in a sense, it's objective in that sense that, you do, if you don't want to get a ticket, you ought to, obey the speeding limit, if you don't want to get that ticket and pay that fine. And even if you don't want to, in some sense, it's still true that you will get a ticket regardless of whether you want to or not. You will still face the consequences regardless of whether you want to or not. And so then someone is defending kind of like a Christian anti-realism would simply say, that's what's consistent with Scripture. We can have like certain consequences regardless. Like if you don't obey God, you sin. Even if you don't regard it as sin yourself, you're still going to suffer the consequences of that. You're still going to go to hell. You're still going to be eternally separated from God. Or may be annihilated, depending on what view you hold. But there'll still be consequences regardless. And so his commands are still kind of applied, regardless. And so I'm more anti-realist is going to say that you can have more facts, kind of like in a fictional sense, like maybe not totally fictional, because in this case, it actually applies to reality because God actually exists. He really is imposing those rules. And you simply have to, either choose to obey those rules or choose not to obey those rules and face the consequences for obeying or not obeying. And so that would kind of be their stance. Now, I think, again, though, more like you were saying, divine command theorists typically do identify themselves as more realists. And the reason why I think is that, I would present some additional criteria to perhaps differentiate between moral realism and anti-realism. So I would say that moral facts that are stance or subject dependent still count as objective if like they're metaphysically necessary. So in the case of God, he's metaphysically necessary. He's a metaphysically necessary being. He exists in all possible worlds. He applies and he kind of basically is in everything. He's omnipresent, right? There's no area or situation where he is not present. So he's a metaphysically necessary being. Second would be it has obligatory force. These moral norms or these moral commands have obligatory force that applies to all contingent moral agents in a certain situation, regardless of the desires, goals, or beliefs. And so as long as he holds those two things, I think it would suffice to count as a moral realist. And I think most divine command theorists do accept that. They believe that regardless of whether you feel it or not, you do still have an inherent moral obligation to obey God, regardless of your desires or goals in mind. And I think, to me, it just it's kind of confusing. I think perfect being theology might be helpful here too, and kind of explain why it's problematic to think of divine command theory, at least it's usually construed, as more anti-realism, because perfect is, in a way, you might say God is the perfect stance. He is the stance of all stances. Or as the Thomists say, there's a sense in which God is being itself. It instantiates all being, all goodness. He is goodness itself, right? Mm-hmm. He is a sense in which all moral facts depend on God. And so, to simply say, well, it depends on his mind. Yeah, but God's mind is a very extremely special case. It's a uniquely unique case of there being only one being of mind, having a perfect mind, having omniscience, having perfect knowledge, and being perfectly good. And so I don't think that kind of counts as a kind of anti-realist position, because you're talking about the fundamental ground of all reality being perfectly good in its nature.
Yeah. Let me just I'll highlight a few things here. One is that certainly a more realist could say, okay, well, I meant by mind any finite mind. It's independent of any finite mind, right? Mm-hmm. But there's also deeper issues at play here, Gil, as I know of how God is conceived of, right? If you think that God is, again, sort of like a minded being like us, just considerably more powerful, considerably smarter. Yeah, I'm going to say that's problematic for many reasons. That's not at all right an appropriate conception of God, right?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think of how to present that and make it relevant without like dragging us into deeper like metaphysical debates between the nature of divinity, if you make sense. But that just shows how intertwined all these issues ultimately are, right?
Yes.
And like you said before, your metaphysics certainly should, but I think it will inevitably inform your ethics, whether you're sort of aware of it or not. Yeah. And I think that there's general issues entirely apart from the ethical considerations you're talking about, of holding to anthropomorphic conception of God to begin with, right? For classical theists, God just is the subsistent good itself. Goodness is going to be convertible with actuality and all that stuff that we'll probably get into as we move along, right? Which is not how a lot of divine command theorists think about it. When I think of a divine command theorist who's a moral realist, probably more in the manner that you're talking about, Gil, I would think of somebody like David Baggett, right? And he does give a very sophisticated account. He is defending moral realism and a divine command theory. So that's kind of, he's kind of, I guess, my weather vane for that camp. And I think he does really good work. Ultimately, I don't think about it the same way he does, but certainly I imagine he's not here to speak for himself, but I wouldn't want to be classified as a moral anti-realist, to my knowledge anyways, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the entire point of usually divine command theory is to avoid Euthyphro's dilemma. That's the whole thing circling in the background. And typically, they're going to want to be like, no, it's not dependent on some external source, or it's not some arbitrary willing of God. It's actually some necessarily willing, or it's grounded, or at least it's grounded in the goodness of God, the necessary goodness of God. Perhaps not entailed, but it's at least very strongly related to his metaphysical goodness.
Right. Yeah. So and again, not to drag us elsewhere, but I don't think that's actually going to work unless you're committed to divine simplicity at the end of the day. Right. I think if you want to get out of Euthyphro's dilemma, or at least diffuse, get out of it, then I think you're going to need to go to way of classical theism for that. Otherwise, you're just going to have a mess of issues to deal with. Right. Because then it'll be like, okay, it's not God himself that is the standard. It's like some part of God, right? Which is kind of weird. Right?
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't want to get sidetracked, so keep going.
Okay. Yeah, and I just kind of want to give a brief case of moral realism for Christians. That is a biblical
Mm-hmm.
case, just if you will allow me to do so, because I think it's important. You know, I do think Christians are going to be curious. Well, what biblical case do we have then that this is actually the view? Can we appeal to some passages? And so this is a brief case. Now, none by no means is exhaustive, but I would say Scripture does tell us that God just is good. He just is goodness. You know, one passage we may see is in Psalms 119:68, where it says, "You are good, and what you do is good." Right? There's you are good by his nature, is good, and what he does is good. Right? There's the action and the being there, relation there. And then there's a certain categorical, I think, norm too there that we can see, where we can see in Acts 5:29, it says, "But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" So how would you have that moral obligation, I would say, unless, you know, you actually have some objective stance that you ought to obey. And so, like, if it's just simply fictional, then it's just like, well, I have my fictional stance. You know, I believe you may believe in your Lord of the Rings Christian story or whatever. I believe in this kind of utter nihilist story, we might say. And so I have no more obligation to follow your story because I just don't agree with it. You know, but Scripture says when you have to obey God rather than men. Now, there's two different standards here: men's standards and God's standards. And so obviously there's a moral obligation that's being there. God's not like, "Oh, you want to follow man's standards? Okay, I get it. You know that you're more anti-realist." No, it seems like you do have an actual obligation to do so. And Peter and the apostles recognize this. We also say John 1:8-10. It's again, that's the passage I was referred to earlier, which it says, "If we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us." So John uses truth in a very objective sense. You know, when he's talking about the historical resurrection, he's talking about Jesus' actions. He is very much reporting on an objective sense. So it's like, well, if we say we have no sin, then saying it's objectively true that we are deceiving ourselves. We're lying, you know. But whereas if I took a more anti-realist position, it'll be like, yeah, it would only be true, you know, perhaps under one interpretation of more anti-realism, that is, it'll only be true relative to like your stance, you know, or your certain cultural standards maybe. And or if I actually adopted a Christian mindset, then it would be true that this statement would be true.
Sure.
But it's not saying that. It's saying if you don't have sin, we deceive ourselves. The truth's not in us, regardless of our stance. So regardless of what theory you take, I think the biblical data actually limits us. God is necessarily good. That goodness is stance independent in the sense that God's not going to change his stance. It doesn't change. It's not contingent. So we have like a categorical imperative to obey. And so it seems extremely implausible to kind of interpret sin in a different light. Simply since sin makes sense only in light of context in which you already accept the Christian worldview.
So I just want to highlight here, and I think this is awesome, Gil. I just want to highlight, because we have listeners across the board, Catholic, right, Christian, atheist, agnostic, that you're actually advancing two cases here. One you haven't even really gotten to yet, which is a defense of moralism. You've done a great job just giving us this sort of survey of the land. But you also want to make the case that if you're a Christian, that you are committed to moral realism as well. And I want to highlight that because somebody might be listening and, I just don't want them to think that moral realism, I just don't want them to think that this is just one argument, right? right? There's two different cases being made here, right? And that's really interesting. I understand that you'll find pretty much anybody who holds any position, but I'm really struggling to think of a conversation I've had with somebody who is a Christian and an anti-realist. I know the names that you've mentioned, but it has to be a very minority position, I imagine. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I haven't seen any surveys, but I imagine that's a pretty minority position. But still,
I agree too. I think, and another guy is Kyle. Kyle Alexander, however you pronounce his last name. He also believes in he's also Christian, more anti-realist. He's Catholic, which is interesting. But anyways, I agree with you. I do think it's an extremely minority position. I don't think anybody from the early church history would have ever interpreted under that light. It just doesn't make sense to me. It seems I don't know what you do with sin. Sin is just kind of relative to like, the sin is this, you reduce it to like some consequences you have from God if you don't believe in him, but you don't really have a moral obligation to believe in him. You're just out of self-interest, you might, out of like,
I would have to, I honestly haven't spent too much time even thinking about that because again, I just haven't encountered those types of conversations, at least not often enough. But I just want to make clear that even if you're not coming at this conversation from a religious perspective,
Mhm.
don't one, still listen to Gil's case of the link between Christianity and moral realism, because that's interesting, but you can still entertain and take seriously the case Gil's going to make for moral realism independent of a religious commitment. I just want to make that clear. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are two separate arguments. So
Mm-hmm.
we'd appeal to like church history, maybe as authoritative, or scripture as another source of revelation, different from natural revelation. So
Mm-hmm.
these are different arguments. So it'll appeal to different people. But yeah. Okay, so I do want to give like a brief summary. Someone asked, or why would you want to be a more anti-realist? What in the world are the motivations for that? Because some people would just be like, yeah, it just seems like obvious that you should be a moralist. And to a degree, I do agree. But someone might argue like, well, there just doesn't seem to be any good arguments for moralism. It just kind of reduces down to these bare intuitions. But then you can imagine scenarios in which, like, what if you had a different planet or a different world in which you had different intuitions, where you felt like, oh, I had to, you're an alien race and you were fighting against this other alien race. And it's, I don't know, what's this called? The warrior race, call them the Xerxes alien race. And they want to eliminate their kind of like moral codes to eliminate every individual to the last survivor.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's their kind of like their moral code. And if rape is even permissible. So they have these strong intuitions there. I mean, what would make it such that those intuitions are wrong? And how do you determine that? These intuitions don't seem to attach to anything concrete in reality. We don't seem to anyways. And so like more anti-realist is kind of just like, I don't see good arguments for this. It's just like, what if I just don't have those intuitions? What if I simply lack them? Like then am I suddenly just, who's right in this case? Who's going to determine that? And I can sympathize with that to a great degree, simply because, when we evaluate ethical discussions in modern philosophy, it tends to be like intuition pumping. You tend to end up being at a stalemate because I just have different intuitions from you. And we're just maybe adding philosophy to conceptualize those intuitions, but we're just conceptualizing intuitions. We're not really getting to the groundwork there.
Yeah. So let me highlight a few things about that. I mean, that it's really the pressures coming from, call it Darwinian counterfactuals, right? I mean, you don't even have to bring in a different. You don't even have to bring in Star Trek scenarios, right? Just imagine that we rewound the evolutionary tape, ran it again, and we got sort of different moral intuitions because of different pressures and stuff like that, right? And I think that is actually really strong reason to be a moral anti-realist if you're a metaphysical naturalist. I do, right? Right. Yeah. I think that is a powerful argument, right? If you have I would say an impoverished metaphysical worldview, you should take the sort of Darwinian counterfactual pressure very seriously in the direction of metaphysical of moral anti-realism. And in fact, Gil, that's sort of my story, right? Because if people who are new to this, like, I was a naturalist for many years, but I had these like deep moral commitments based on intuition, but I always felt this tension between where I felt my worldview should be leading me in terms of, okay, it seems like I should really be an anti-realist and a nihilist here, but darn it, right? I just don't feel that way. These intuitions seem so obvious, right? Now, ultimately, like, those intuitions are so strong, and we have intuitions across the board about many things that I think are in conflict or tension with certain metaphysical paradigms, my relevant background being naturalism. And it's not just morality, it's freedom of the will and many other things aside. And ultimately, I found I switched my worldview, not only because of, it mapped best with the intuitions. Intuitions play a role. But I do want to say now that the worldview of the Thomistic worldview of natural law, I think I can say it makes the best sense of our best intuitions, right? And now I can also give a story, an evolutionary origin story, that can get around the pressure of Darwinian counterfactuals that I don't think a naturalist can, for example. So what I'm actually doing is I'm actually wanting to grant a lot to that certain argument, that its force is considerable, but only embedded in a particular metaphysical paradigm, if that makes sense. Do you agree with that, Gil?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it makes total sense. I can agree and sympathize with a lot of them, just because I'm like, this is not very persuasive. You're just kind of stuck at this point where we're just competing worldviews using intuitions, and obviously that's not going to get us anywhere when our very fundamental convictions in which we interpret those intuitions are radically or fundamentally different. Right. And that's the whole point, and I definitely think that we could do better in providing those arguments. So yeah, I definitely agree there. And I think it's important to kind of note that so that we can be fair to that.
And I also want to acknowledge, and this is a point that somebody who's not a theist, Michael Huemer, makes, who is a moral realist, right?
Yeah.
A lot of it is based on intuitions. And now there's, many defenses that are given from intuitions. Like you, Gil, I think we need to go further. And if we're relying on intuitions, I want a story about why those intuitions are reliable, at least generally, right?
Yeah.
I need to know why these intuitions should be generally reliable. And that, of course, brings us again to wider epistemological concerns and worldview concerns. So again, everything is sort of connected here and everything matters. So you can't like just solve these issues within one domain. It is going to cause you to branch out. And that brings us back to the point we said at the beginning of the conversation of what was so attractive to Thomism about me is how interconnected and systematic it is, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, it's true. And I typically going back to this worldview where it's like, well, if you have a naturalistic in a metaphysical sense, view of like reality, and everything is explained by natural causes. There are no divine or supernatural causes outside intervening. It seems to me then you would reduce to like an evolutionary kind of perspective, at least like something like the evolutionary debunking argument, where like, why should I trust these intuitions as actually ascribing any kind of moral facts about reality, simply because evolution simply selected it for like some advantage for us, So it kind of like produces a sort of if not a distrust, then an agnosticism about whether these actually tie into anything about reality, right? It doesn't seem as if evolution would, though. It seems that it actually, in fact, seems unlikely that evolution would. So that'd be an argument that they would give, somewhat, at least some more anti-religious would give. Not all of them think that that's persuasive. I don't think. Right. I think King B and maybe Lance Bush don't ascribe to evolution debunking argument. But there are those who do. And so it just depends on what your ontology is. And so that leads to, again, even to another argument they might give is like they think that this is a simpler ontology. Because, obviously, as a moral realist, you're introducing a whole other category of being to reality. You're saying there are moral facts that actually are true of reality. And so it doesn't, and do we need them though? And then so the anti-realists typically say, no, we don't. The more anti-realist position is just as explanatorily powerful as moral realism. We would still act in the ways that we do. We would still act in a moral way, regardless of whether these objective moral values existed, because that's our subjective preference. So even if I had a moral obligation, say, to torture a baby, could I ever, psychologically speaking, do so? Could I ever do that? And it just seems like, no, I could. Even if I wanted to try to obey that norm, I couldn't. And so they would say, like, yeah, there's no real explanatory difference in terms of either actions, or we can still have the same moral language and have the same moral talk without any appeal to this objective moral realm, right? That we need to appeal to something. So and it also leads to all kinds of questions that the moral realist has to debate. Well, what's the nature of this moral realm? Does it depend on the natural world? Does it depend on some non-natural world? It just leads to all kinds of complexities. Whereas a more anti-realist simply says, no, we can explain all these quite simply. We can just, as a psychological state, whatever you might propose. And so then what might appeal to as well is that they might agree with Mackey, morality just seems like queer. It just seems so weird that we would exist, something like that. Because you can't observe it, you can't taste it, you can't really, it's not a relation of language or a relation of ideas. We're not reasoning analytically or a priori to get to these moral facts. It just seems like the only way we access it is through this intuition. And this intuition is not something that can be reduced to some rational principle, or unless you're Kant, but, and so it just seems quite strange, though, that they exist at all in this world that we live in. And so that would be Mackey's argument, and that would be some anti-realist argument as well. So it just doesn't seem as if we need moral realism. That would be the general overview. Now, there's a lot more argumentation there, and to be fair to them, you got to do more research, but I think that kind of gives like a little bit of a case, an overview from where they're coming from.
Right. And this is I mean, a typical structure of argument, right? Hey, look, I can explain just as much with less. So let's go with my theory,
Correct.
right? That's essentially what's being said, right?
Yeah.
So what should the moral realist say in response to that, Gil? Huh?
Okay.
Or should we just end the stream here and just raise the white flag?
No, absolutely not. There's a lot to say. So what I'll do, I will try to explain some key, I guess, tenets of the Thomistic moral realist. So let me start with that, and then I'll give a defense of that.
Can I give it just a few points in response real quick to that? I mean, let's first, it should, I mean, simpler theories are not always better, right? Simplicity is a secondary consideration, first to explanatory power, right? So first there's the assertion that they can explain just as much, but if we're committed to the idea that there are objective moral, obligations, they haven't explained it by eliminating it, right? It's like eliminativism with consciousness, right? I mean, I guess you guys are committed to less things, but you've utterly failed to explain something that is so obviously there, right? Here's the simplest theory I can think of, right? Nothing exists. Can't beat that in terms of parsimony.
It's true.
But it sucks, right? Because it explains it sucks, right? And I shouldn't have to explain why it sucks, right?
Right.
So I've never been like hugely impressed with these types of arguments because they always seem to be like deeply question making, right?
Yeah.
Always a little sleight of hand going on. But again, I just wanted to put out that general disclaimer, right? A lot of theories that either try to eliminate or replace certain things, always to my mind, even if we grant them an advantage in parsimony or simplicity, which I think is not always the case because they almost have to come back around and wire in more components later on to shore something up that got deconstructed in the process of elimination or replacement, right? Well, we haven't really given an adequate explanation, right, at the end of the day. So that's just my general, not just to this debate, but wider, like be on the lookout for this type of, when you see that type of argument, always just be on the lookout for it, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a too overly simplistic response. So they do that, like maybe what atheists would typically say, well, like, yeah, we don't need this God to explain anything. But then you don't really have any explanation ultimately. It seems as if, well, why does anything exist at all? Why is there any kind of causality? At the end of the day, you've adopted a simple ontology, but at what cost? And I think that as a more anti-realist is going to take some bullets there.
And it's not always real quick. It's not always so clear that it is a simpler ontology because we're like, well, look, we've got just contingent things. You've got contingent and necessary things. So look, you got something else. Well, hold on. Right. I've got contingent things that are all grounded and cause. You've now got contingent things that some might be grounded and other like entirely uncaused contingent things, right? So
correct. Yeah.
It's just not always as quick and easy as it might initially seem, is all I'm saying, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate you making that point. Yeah, it's definitely true. So we need to keep that in mind. And so I'm going to get to that intuition argument in a second, respond to them on intuition. But before I do, I just kind of like want to outline what I'm be arguing for, just so I can make that clear to everybody. So Thomistic moral realism, what are the tenets of Thomistic moral realism? So I will say the first tenet is that, again, at least some of these moral claims are truth apt. So that's just cognitivism, basically just saying that they're capable of being true or false. We as Thomists all agree with that. At least some of these moral claims are true. It's the second tenet. Third tenet, they're true in, I guess, a mind-independent way. So we take a more realist position about things. And how we define mind-independent, I'm going to exclude God because God is a necessary mind in this case. But so that's the third tenet. Fourth tenet would be these moral facts are not only accessible to us, but we know at least some of these moral facts. So the Thomist is going to affirm that we can know some of these moral facts. Like that just goes with like Aquinas' natural law philosophy. And so this fifth tenet would be that Thomistic naturalism or natural law provides the best grounding and case for moral facts. So this is the metaphysical thesis. So, and what we're basically saying here, what I'm going to be saying here is that moral facts flow quite naturally from a Thomistic metaphysics. So I'm reasoning about objects and their causal powers, and we derive certain natural kinds or essentialism. And from that essentialism, we derive their purposes or their teleology. And so from that teleology or natural purposes, we derive their natural goodness. And from a rational agent's natural goodness, we derive moral goodness. right? It's not just it's important to note that for this system of thought, it's not just like this moral system is not annexed or attached like a third arm to a human being. It's actually quite natural. It'd be as natural as having 2 arms and 2 legs. That's how natural the system is. It just flows from each other.
That's right.
And so that's what I really like about a Thomistic approach to this, is because it just seems so natural and unified, rather than some kind of attached third limb or something that just doesn't seem natural to you. It doesn't seem like it fits. You may be able to make it fit to some extent. It just seems weird.
Right. It's not contrived. That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's not contrived, which is always good to have in terms of theory, right? Less ad hocness, right? And also just want to make clear that even though you're going to be giving the Thomistic case here, I'm sure you would agree with this, Gil. Certainly, I think of Thomas as sort of I guess people disagree with me about this, but I often think of Thomas as like the last great classical philosopher more than like the first great medieval philosopher. Like I see him like bringing to a sort of beautiful completion lines of thought from Aristotle, from the Neoplatonists, all of that, right? So I just like, it's not just Thomas here. Like Thomas himself obviously makes important contributions, but he also his brilliance is in being an incredible synthesizer of thought as well, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think I never even thought of that, but I do think that makes sense because he's Aristotelian. He uses Plato's philosophy, kind of synthesizes the both, and Augustine as well. These are all classical thinkers.
Boethius, right?
Yeah, Boethius. He's synthesizing classical thought. That's really what he's doing. He's not, and he's creating some additional novelties, I suppose. It might be like,
big ones. I mean, De Ente Essentia is like hugely original, right? Yeah. So it's definitely not right to say that Thomas was just a synthesizer. Correct. He was a major contributor as well, but indeed still a brilliant synthesizer, right?
Exactly. Yeah, totally agree with that. And so for like Thomas, in our way of thinking about the natural world, it's important to know what we mean by natural world. And so I think by natural world simply mean whatever is subject to the 5 senses, directly or indirectly, as well as whatever is subject to our inferences or deductions involving abstracting from concrete objects, to like certain abstract things. I'm not going to get into that too much, but basically, because like when we talk about natural philosophy for Thomists, it's a lot more broad in the sense that it's basically the job of natural philosophy is to describe every possible physical world, right? It's not to go into the metaphysics realm quite yet, and it's like this in between state between the sciences, the empirical sciences, and metaphysics, you might say. That might be a proper way to say that, is that the natural philosophy is in between those two. It's like the stepping ground to a metaphysical thesis. And so when we're talking about natural philosophy, we're reasoning from the things that we can see, observe, and know, through our senses, or through our perception some way, or through our reason, reasoning about the things that are around us, about matter, what's nature of matter. And then articulating a thought where, okay, this is the nature of matter, not just like the matter in this particular state, it's made of rubber. This particular matter is made of it's a tree matter, wood, say. But there are different types of matter, but we come to this abstract using reason to kind of reason through what matter in general is. It comes to concept like secondary matter, prime matter, for example.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, again, for Aristotle, philosophy of nature, his physics concerns mobile being, right? And it's by working there first that you get various arguments for immaterial being, and then that gives you the discipline of metaphysics, of studying being, qua being insofar as it is being, right? Now, there are Thomists who disagree with that procedure. They say, no, you can dive right into metaphysics. You don't have to start in philosophy of nature, but that's not a debate that we need to get into now, right?
Yeah, no. So that's just a brief introduction. So, okay. So now in order for me to kind of like give a defense of moral realism, I kind of want to start with the moral datum. So basically the moral datum is what are some facts about moral experience that's shared by all or nearly all of mankind. So if aliens were to visit, perhaps another way to put it, if aliens were to visit, what would they observe in us? What would be something to observe or some, in our behavior, in our talk? And so these are the moral datum, the thing that we all take for granted, as even anti-realists will kind of appeal to these things. And they may quibble with one or two details here of what I'm about to say, but I think for the most part, we can agree with the general outline or thesis here that I'm going to promote here. So when you reflect on your moral activity, think about what you're doing. Like it seems as if we really do talk as if they are moral facts, as if they're real, as if they're objective, as if they're authoritative, that they make sense, they're intelligible, and that there's a certain stance independence to them. We act as if it's unlike our subjective preferences or our social norms or constructions. We can see this very clearly through religious history, for example, the Buddhist, ways, or Christian thinking about the Ten Commandments, even Islam, and all these different religious ideas seem to advance this idea. Yeah, this is the authoritative thing, and regardless of whether you want to or not, you ought to obey God. You ought to do these things, or you ought to make these sacrifices to these gods. Regardless, that religious history is quite strong, quite prominent in our history as human beings. And so, like, even in our daily interaction today, just think of anything that we're talking about, whether it's going to be abortion, whether it's going to be Black Lives Matter, we all come with like certain values to talk. Humans have intrinsic value. They have certain rights, human rights, intrinsic rights, like our inalienable rights. We assume this, and we have this oughtness talk as well. We talk about what we ought to do. And we regard moral facts as being morally obligatory, and that makes sense. It's intelligible to us. It's not like some nonsensical statement like a square circle. You ought to be a square circle. That doesn't make any sense. It's saying that we ought to be virtuous. We ought to be kind to others. We ought to be loving toward others. We ought to be, in some cases, in our modern society, tolerant. We have to be kind, and we have to accept their identities. We have a moral obligation to accept whatever identity they may ascribe to themselves. So these are things that we all ascribe to, or that culture, German culture, we think that their Nazi culture particularly is immoral.
Right.
We may think,
don't be a Nazi, which implies that being a Nazi is bad. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Or even in the Russian-Ukraine crisis right here, people like morally condemning Russia. And like, well, what right do you have to condemn more to Russia if you're like from some different culture, way of thinking? Maybe according to Russia's way of thinking is correct if you're relativist, or maybe there's no way in which that's correct to think about, So we act as if, though, all the time, as if there's something condemnable about what Russia's doing or condemnable about certain actions. So we have this kind of oughtness and value talk. We think we're intrinsically valuable. And when someone says I'm worthless, you don't tell them, yeah, okay, if that's what you think, then I guess you are worthless,
If you feel that way, then you must be worthless, right?
Yeah. I'm like, no, we don't think that. We think they have value regardless of whether they feel that way, regardless of whether they want to kill themselves or not. And that's how human societies operate. We think there's a certain way in which we ought to be. And we're meeting that oughtness, or we're failing to meet that standard. Right. And so that happens all the time. And that seems something we take for granted. Like when someone steals something from someone else, like, hey, you can't steal that. That's mine. And like someone says who, and this whole debate between the two is like a moral exchange there. And we're all implicitly or very strongly like assuming some kind of oughtness, some kind of standards, some kind of values that we all are we all know to be true. And we also engage in moral reasoning. Because we couldn't engage in moral reasoning if it's just a matter of preferences. You can't reason your way to say, no, vanilla is actually the superior flavor. Well, in my opinion, chocolate's the superior flavor. But, you can't reason like through some kind of axioms and mathematical calculus or what have you, some philosophical or metaphysical argument that will prove without a doubt that, vanilla is the best flavor, say.
You like hot fudge sundaes, Gil?
I do.
I had one last night.
Oh, nice.
Few peanuts on top. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oof. Yeah, and anyone who doesn't like that is obviously
this is wrong.
This is wrong,
Sick even. Yeah.
So, Right. Yeah. And so that reminds me, another argument for more anti-realism would be gastronomic realism. It's kind of a parody argument of more realism. I'll get to that in a second.
Right.
Just remind me about that gastronomic realism and taste and preferences. But anyways, so we have this more ability to more reason through things. We can assign more properties to actions or events, and then reason from one premise to another in the same way we do about any other fact about reality. So, like, for example, if I say if it's wrong to murder somebody, then it's wrong to murder John, right? It just kind of follows logically if you accept the premises there. And so you were able to reason in that way. We're able to appeal to other rational principles. Like, for example, when we're arguing for pro-life positions, we're able to argue for more fundamental values to make the case that, hey, this is why this person has values, why the fetus has value. And so we're kind of able to engage in that kind of more reasoning. And that wouldn't be possible if it's just simply a matter of preference or there's no way in which there's something objective, independent of us that we're actually discovering or tying ourselves to. It makes more sense to think of it as objective. Well, I'm making an argument right now. Sorry, I shouldn't be mixing that right now.
Might there be a difference between wants and needs, right?
Yeah. I guess you could say that. Yeah. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I didn't want to jump ahead. No, I think, what is, I'm obviously a committed essentialist like you, Gil, right? So what we ought to do should conform with right desire. But what is right desire? Well, it's what we need, right? What perfects us given human nature, right? You can never, you can want things that you don't really need, right?
Right.
And it is wrong to want things that you don't need insofar as they interfere with the things that you really need, right? So the traditional distinctions that philosophers like Aristotle and Thomas are going to make that help deal with these, gastronomical, whatever the intestinal term is, right? Objections, right? Or just, I think the obvious distinctions between wants and needs, apparent goods and real goods, right? Apparent goods, real goods, wants and needs. Not all wants are wrong, right? Or call them acquired desires rather than natural desires. That's another distinction, right? Natural desires, right, correspond with our natural appetitive drives, whereas acquired desires, like our affinity for hot fudge sundae, right? Can be appropriate at times, right? But if I just had one yesterday, and that was fine. We were celebrating. Actually, we I don't know if you heard the news, Gil. My wife gave birth to baby Brigga just last week, so we wanted to go out and take Brigga out for her first outing, and we celebrated with a hot fudge sundae. But of course, I could come to desire that hot fudge sundae a little too often, and it could begin to interfere with my needs of what actually causes me to flourish as a human being. And to that extent, I would start to be committing some moral miscalculations, we might say. So that's I know you're going to get into all this, but I actually think the simple language of wants and needs is just a good way to sort of begin to introduce the Aristotelian Thomistic paradigm between acquired and natural desires and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I really like that. I'm glad you mentioned that. So we'll definitely get into that a little more. So we're going to get that pretty soon, actually. I just wanted to finish off the moral datum part, where it seems as we talk about as if moral values are objectively true. It's kind of like maybe you might say quasi-realism. You might label that if you want to label that. Also, another thing is that we have authority. We make moral statements as if they have some special kind of authority. Mackey makes his point too. We act as if moral statements have this authority. Or you should not murder. You know that's wrong. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. And so we carry it as having authority, so that we can debate moral statements in a way that we cannot debate, like, say, personal tastes.
And we don't laugh at that when somebody says, "Gil, you should have the hot fudge sundae." People will understand, like, that's cute, that's funny, but it's not like, "Gil, you shouldn't go murder innocent people," right?
Exactly. So it's a huge difference in there. So, like, we take it as authoritative, whereas we don't take these personal tastes as authoritative. And then Mackey also makes the additional point is that we seem to have extreme emotional reaction to those who deny not those, but to denying that they're objective moral facts, because it seems to lead to a kind of nihilism, really. I mean, if you're being, like, I think in my opinion, consistent, it would seem as if, like, if there are more values, then I can simply kind of construct whatever is beneficial to me, reality or some kind of norms, whatever I feel is beneficial to my existence. And that may include, like, not getting caught, going to jail or something. But there are certain things, like, I can do that I can get away with, and that would be considered immoral by other people. And so, like, where does that come from? It seems to kind of lead to a very extreme emotional reaction. Like, man, how could you believe that? How could you believe that slavery is okay objectively? Maybe personally you think it's okay. Maybe personally you think it's not okay. You maybe have, like, some emotional reaction to that. But, like, can you really say that those slave owners were doing nothing wrong? Are you really saying us that, even though you personally find it wrong and abhorrent? Like, that doesn't seem acceptable. So a lot of people have this extreme kind of emotional reaction because they kind of, like, almost know, like, hey, there's something wrong with that idea. I don't think that way, And so Mackey makes that point. So that's the summary of the data. If an alien was to visit us, they would see that we talk with value language, like this things have to have intrinsic value. We act as if there's some kind of oughtness to the world, or some kind of how we ought to act with respect for our feelings and desires. And we tell people this. We say, no, it doesn't matter. Parents tell their kid, I don't care if you don't feel like you're doing that. You got to clean up your room right now, or you got to treat your sister well, and then all these, like, we make these moral commands as if they're authoritative, right? And so this is all part of the moral datum, the moral experience that we all have as human beings. So I think it's important as we get into what I'm going to get into, like, what I call the argument from common sense. So maybe, do you want to add anything before I get into that?
No, I think that was brilliant. I mean, I think that there are more data points that need to be accounted for.
Yeah,
I mean, we talk about there being moral progress, genuine moral progress, genuine increases in moral
true.
knowledge. We all have this. I think this relates to revelation, but we have this deep, I think, need of moral help at times, right? So I think our moral experience is exceedingly rich and wide, and often wider than we immediately recognize. And yeah, but we can work with just the ones that you've put out so far, right?
Yeah. My list is by no means exhaustive. I'm sure there's a lot more we could add to that, but I just thought that would be a good starting point.
And I will say that the data of normativity goes down. I mean, even those who are arguing for anti-realism think that you should follow the arguments. You should follow the arguments for anti-realism, right? That there's normative moral language, right? Even in the realm of judgment, rational discourse, all of that, right? So I just want to point that out as well. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's get into the heart of it. So I am a common sense philosopher. So I really like Adler. I really like his emphasis on common sense. I like Aristotle. I think Aquinas was very much a common sense philosopher. And there's a certain sense that, that goes by different names. You might see common sense go by something like properly basic beliefs by Plantinga. He talks about that. You might hear it said by analytic philosophers referred to as intuition, maybe. You may hear it in certain sciences referred to as maybe folk psychology. And the basic gist of common sense is that we all have a starting point of all human thought. There's a starting point which we have to start with. We all assume certain things. We all take certain things for granted in order to reason at all, in order to even function at all as a human being. We all take these things as granted as certain axioms. So I'm definitely very strongly a common sense philosopher. And so I want to kind of maybe give what does that mean? Someone might say, what is common sense? Is it the same as intuition? Is it something different? So I do want to think. I want to quote from Adler here. I think he has a good definition, or at least a good starting definition here. Let me see. Let me try to get it. Where is it? Okay. So first, let me start with Adler, where he says, the proper method of philosophy calls for reliance upon common experience, but not just for reliance on common sense. A philosopher who adopted the empirical method would naturally respect the common sense beliefs that have risen from the same experiences to which he himself appeals. Another thing he says, common sense includes experiences which are the same for all men, everywhere, at all times. So there's something distinct about common sense, because someone might say, well, it was common sense at one point that the earth was flat, maybe. Or that everything revolved around the Earth, that all the stars and the galaxies revolved around the Earth, and so that might be this initial objection to common sense. And I think that's simply a misunderstanding.
It is a misunderstanding of what was meant by common sense in the technical aspect here.
Yeah, and we're using it in a much more precise philosophical sense because again, people might say, "Oh, it's common sense in a day that slavery, was permissible."
So there's a difference between common sense as Adler's using it and widely held belief, for example.
Correct. Yeah. So common sense is just simply kind of appealing to whatever is common to the experience. Whatever, as he said, it's common to all men, the same for all men at all times. So
I mean, for example, Adler is great. He's saying you don't need any special training or equipment to access it, right? So, for example, what is accessible to many scientists is not accessible to everybody at all times and all ages, right? A lot of it depended on advancements in technology and specialized training. Adler's saying, this is why Adler says philosophy is everybody's business. Not that everybody is meant to be a professional philosopher, but you kind of have available to you what you need to just do philosophy if you want to, right?
Absolutely. And so again, to quote him, because I think he's super clear. I love how clear Adler is. So that's why I'm quoting him. So he says again, common sense includes experiences which are the same for all men everywhere at all times. Ordinary persons of such widely different location of time and space and cultural background could, I say, immediately communicate with the aid of an interpreter about the things common to their ordinary experience. These things include seasonal changes, day to night shifts, living, dying, eating, sleeping, losing, finding, getting, giving, standing, and moving in space, etc. The core of common experience consists of those things about which communication is universally possible, and with regard to which it is possible to translate certain of the statements made in any human language into equivalent statements in any other. And that's really helpful, because it's like, these are common things. It wasn't common. It's not common to, the reason why they're common is because it's common to human nature. I think that's an important thing. It stems from human nature, what it means to be human. That's why we can talk about sleeping.
Right. It doesn't mean, and it doesn't mean everyone's going to analyze and interpret it all the same way. That's important.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so, it's important, because we all experience the flow of time. We all experience change in some way, either whether it's a change in thought processes, like going from one premise to another premise, or moving about in some location, from one location to another location. Change is pretty fundamental to our experience, and so that's why when we say against Parmenides, we can reasonably say, no, that's contrary to common sense, because we take common sense to be the starting point of all human knowledge. It's necessarily so. It's not like it's an option. You necessarily start with that. That's how you come. That's how you perceive the world. That's how you are by nature, And so when you experience change, you're experiencing real change either mentally or externally through perception. And so Parmenides' argument that, well, there is no change flies flatly in the face of common sense.
Right. And did it require me changing my mind to be convinced about it? Right.
Exactly. So it's kind of self-refuting, at that point. And so so Aristotle made that point. It is self-refuting. It flies contrary to everything that we know from fundamental human experience. And so there's a lot of things that we take to be commonsensical, I think. It's common sense that, things go in and out of existence. It's common sense that things have causes, that it just doesn't pop into existence out of nothing, or things at the very least have explanations of some sort. There's some explanations. There's some ways in which we ought to reason, in a logical way. We ought to reason logically. And we perceive, other minds. We believe there are other minds. And so we think that, it's not as if that's an illusion, or like some robotic being that's imitating something, imitating a human being, or like some kind of like walking zombies, as Chalmers' example of human zombies. They're actually, we really do have minds. There really are causes. The world, there really is an external world to us. That's what we perceive. We're immediately confronted with being. We experience being. Being is fundamental. I experience either the being of something external to me. I experience my own being through self-reflection. I experience maybe the being of some lesser being, like ideas in my head. Like, they don't exist in reality, perhaps, if I'm just complimenting some fictional idea. But nevertheless, it has some kind of being. So we're all confronted with being. That's just our default, mode of operation, is that as humans, we're thrown into being, to beingness. If we might talk like Heidegger there.
Right. So, yeah. But I mean, the deistic starting point, especially for epistemology, is not thinking it's being is. That's a deistic starting point. Right.
It's very important to note that here. And that's because that's how we're viewing common sense. That common sense we're just throwing ourselves into being. We're knowing the being of other minds. We know the being of other objects. We know the being of some other being interacting with other beings in a relationship that we have with those other beings. So common sense is super important. It's fundamental. Every philosopher, every scientist utilizes it. There's no escaping it. It's a necessary part of human reasoning, a necessary part of human experience. So that's really important. It's a starting point. And I will say that I guess, because there's a distinction between common sense and then the interpretation of that common sense, like you were saying. Our interpretation of the common sense can be wrong, right? But I do think I want to start with like common sense and then say this with, I guess, humor. I'm going to borrow from Michael Huemer here, what he calls the principal phenomenal conservatism. Not sure if anyone's heard of that, but the basic idea, or it's kind of like a Maury idea in a way, is that you basically start with what seems to be the case. And if what seems to be the case is probably it's probably true.
Right. Seemings can infer, can grant justification, right?
Correct. Yeah. Seemings can grant justification. So it seems to me that other minds exist. So that justifies my belief that there are other minds. It seems to me that there's an external world. So that justifies my belief that there is an external world. And in a similar sense, we can also likewise say, it seems to me that there are moral facts. So therefore, that justifies me in my belief that there are moral facts. And so this on the basis of our common sense, if that's what it seems, that seemingness. And so I think Moore also makes a really good, compelling point too. And in addition, he adds to this, I think strengthens this, because it seems to us like what I can maybe, like, I think Bertrand Russell gave a whole book length proof of 1 + 1 = 2, and it seems like, he's pretty brilliant. He probably made a really great case, but what am I more convinced of? Am I more convinced of his argument or the belief that, yeah, this just seems obvious that 1 + 1 = 2? And it seems like, yeah, like more would say, no, it's far more obvious to me that 1 + 1 = 2 than any of the proofs or logical argumentation that Bertrand Russell gave, because I'm not 100% sure if he argued in a completely valid way. That whole book, huge book, So I'm far more sure of these initial appearances of what things seem to be than any of these other alternatives, right? And so that gives us like justification for believing the way that we do.
No, finish your thought, then I'll chime in. Yep.
Yeah. And so like, I think that's really important because, people might say we don't have any justification, but I think common sense makes it clear, given the moral datum that we just referred to here, that is common to our moral experience. We make moral judgments. We feel an argument has moral force or normative force. We believe in moral progress. We believe in rights or equality. And our moral discourse is just laden with normativity and like something it doesn't depend on whether you feel that way or not.
Yeah. So that just links back to the point I made way earlier on, where many people, even non-theists, will say like, look, I've got these incredible seemings, right? That's the term philosophers love to use these days. Of this, just like acquaintance with the moral realm, right? And that's just so much more obvious to me than any of the arguments against moral realism, that I'm just justified to go continue on in my belief in moral realism, right? That's that is a common response. And I think there's definitely something to that. I know some Thomists don't like seemings and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I know.
My thought is intuition is certainly a good opening gambit, and especially undefeated intuition, which I think we have in this case, is a very strong opening gambit. But the case can of course go much further than that as well.
Yeah, right. And of course, someone of the skeptic will probably push back and say something like, well, maybe what if I just don't share that sense of seemingness? Or, what if like I think that differently? Like, well, moral facts may seem like they're objectively true to you, but I just don't share that kind of like, I guess, perception. And I would just say that it seems to me, whenever we're confronted with being, our default position is to take it in a realist sense. So and that doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be true, but our interpretive faculty. So remember, we have two distinct things working at work here: the common sense, and then maybe the interpretive faculty that's kind of interpreting that common sense. And usually, by default, we take what we perceive to be, what we're perceiving to be actually the case. If I perceive that, that there's a human being next to me, that's probably the case, unless there's some kind of prior conditions, like where I took LSD or something, that kind of may have affected those normal conditions. And so, so it seems like we're justified in taking reality at face value, or taking our common sense at face value, because we have a natural impulse to interpret it in a realist sense. So I think the natural impulse is to interpret things in a realist way. That doesn't necessarily mean that our interpretive faculty is going to always be correct, but I think that gives us, you have to give strong evidence, I suppose, to argue otherwise. Because take, for example, I don't know, say I saw a squirrel, my immediate impression is going to be like, oh no, that doesn't exist. No, my immediate impression is, even instinctively, is going to simply say that exists, that's objective. Even if I'm not having it overtly in my mind, I have this overt belief, but I'm instinctively taking it to be real. Unless I have some prior conditions in which obviously that modifies the case.
Right. I gave you some squirrel hallucination pills, Gil.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And if you came into that information, then maybe you've got a defeater of it. But what you're saying here is, not infallible, but our position is generally reliable. Right.
Correct. Yes. And that's important because it just, to me, it seems like, the moralist might push back and simply say, well, I can explain all that you can. I don't have to appeal to any more moral facts. And I'm like, okay, maybe even if I grant that, like suppose someone tried to explain why I saw a squirrel, and they say, well, it's equally plausible that you saw some kind of like a robotic squirrel or a hologram, very sophisticated robot, and that explains your perception. Like, okay, well, that's possible, I suppose. Like the Matrix is possible too, perhaps, because the Matrix, in theory, anyways, can theoretically explain everything.
Let me give you one better, man. I mean, solipsism is like the most beautiful case here, because shoot, man, that seems like a pretty simple theory. And the solipsist is gonna be like, look, I can explain that squirrel, right? It's just a projection of your mind, which is the only thing that exists, right? So it can't, but everybody knows solipsism is insane and false, right? Now, why? Well, a big part of it is just deep intuition, right?
Yeah.
But but also it just can't be the case that whatever the quote unquote leaner ontology is, or the more parsimonious is the default starting point, because then we'd be up against a task of continually trying to refute solipsism, which is actually pretty hard to do, right? So that can't be the criteria here. But then I would also go on to say, like, look, in order to actually give an explanation from a solipsist standpoint, you're actually going to have to start to wire a lot of complexity into your solipsistic theory of why exactly a squirrel is being projected at that point. So at the end of the day, it's going to actually come out really contrived and ad hoc, right? So initial appearances can be deceiving. But even putting that aside, even if we just granted that it was overall a simpler theory, most people be like, no, you actually really haven't given an adequate good explanation here. And that position is just clearly not the case, right? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I think it's also important, because you're reminding me of something. It's important to make a distinction between individual perceptions and your common perceptions, maybe, because you can have individual moments where your perceptions are not reliable, perhaps. But it seems like, common to our experiences change, something broad, some general, principle, some general experience. So when I'm talking about common sense, I'm only talking about general experiences. I'm not talking about your particular experience at time 1 or time 2, where you had this experience with, like, you saw a squirrel or saw some other mind. I'm just speaking in general, and that's what common sense is referring to, not necessarily any particular experience, but just in general, your experience taken together as a collective.
Let me just put one quick mention here. If people want to see how upon substantial analysis these more radically skeptical scenarios turn out to be actually far more complicated, see Lydia McGrew and Tim McGrew on this, because they have a really good analysis of, like, Descartes' demon scenarios and various deceiver scenarios, which show no, actually these become very contrived and ad hoc and just extremely implausible at the end of the day upon analysis, that they actually do not deserve the title of being more parsimonious, whether it's Descartes' demon or solipsism or whatever. So that's, of course, another conversation, but I want that to be out there for people to dive into if they're curious about that.
That's a good point, because I think this whole discussion is quite similar. I think common sense is a package deal. It's not as if you can pick and choose little things here, like perception or moral facts. Those are things that are all common to all mankind. We all understand what morality is. We all understand what we ought to do, what not to do. This isn't just some, like, you can detach it from the box to me. It's common sense comes in a package. So if you try to say, I'm gonna reject moral facts as being like a realist interpretation, then it just seems like you're kind of like, you might as well throw the whole package away too, because the same reasoning that's used to justify them is also being used to justify moral beliefs. And so I think that's important to make. And then, but someone might push back, and again, they might say something like, well, I don't have those intuitions, I don't have that interpretive faculty that you say you're inclined to have, especially about moral facts. And they might parody it, might say something like, well, what if someone says, I just simply have a common sense view that gastronomic realism is true, right? It's just common sense, like it's common to moral, to our moral interaction. Now, the problem with that, though, is I don't think there's any gastronomic datum, that where it says that there's progress, or we're actually making progress about what tastes better. We don't have that datum.
We've really progressed in understanding that hot fudge sundaes are the superior choice to, I don't know, turtle sundaes. There we go. Which is, I guess that's a type of hot fudge sundae. Which one's the genus and species there? I don't know.
I'm not sure, but that's And that shows us still that we don't treat the same way. We don't feel moral offense if someone's eating chocolate in front of us, or vanilla, which we consider the inferior color or something. Like, how could you eat that? Like, that's ridiculous. There's no moral offense. There's no way in which we're engaging in some kind of gastronomic reasoning. That part is just not part of, like, our reality. At best, though, what we might say that has some sort of realism is that, well, it's objectively better. It's better to eat these type of foods than these other type of foods. Right? That might be the case, because for your body, if you're trying to, you want health, you want to give it the proper nutrients, and so as natural law theorists, we believe that our nature determines what's good for us. So there's certain things in which we can say, eating, or drinking Clorox is objectively bad for you, right? There are certain objective constraints. So
let me just put this away then.
So, there's certain objective realist constraints when it comes to maybe eating. But other than that, that's all there is. It's not as in detail as there is for, like, moral realism. And so I think that's a big distinction there to make. And so that moral datum is just not the same. This doesn't support gastronomic realism. It does moral realism. That would be the major point. I would say the parity argument just doesn't work, because there's no parity. is disanalogous in my view. And so like someone might say, okay, still though, I still don't have that common sense. Are you trying to make an argument for me? They might say, I don't have that view. I'm like, well, actually, I think almost the vast majority of moral anti-realists will agree with the data. I mean, it might quibble for a few things here and there, how I maybe interpret things, but they would overall agree with the moral datum. The question is more of the interpretation of that datum, they might say, as to where the difference is. And I just don't see that the most natural instinctive maybe interpretation would be a moral realist interpretation. Right. I think they would argue. So how do you account for me? Because I never maybe in my life ever had this intuition, they might say, intuition versus common sense. So first, I want to make a clarification of what I think the difference is between common sense and intuition. Now, this is my reflection. It might be just pretty much eclectic at this point. But my belief is that intuition is a distinct, intuition is like this, it's this unreasoned justification, like via a kind of immediate justification.
Right. It's non-inferential, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's not inferential. It's not as if I'm arguing from some reasoned justification, like from like the first way or something to argue for something. It's just an unreasoned justification. But it's a kind of, I would say, interpretation. It's a natural interpretation of common sense. Common sense is the experience itself, the experience of our experience of being encountering with being, of ourselves and other things. But then there's the again, like I was talking about, the interpretive faculty. You can have, I think, intuition is kind of like an unreasoned interpretive faculty. It's an instinctive interpretive faculty to me, and so it derives from the common sense, and it usually is if cultivated in the proper conditions, in a proper environment, that will generally lead to accurate intuitions. But say you're cultivating in certain, like you're growing up in Nazi Germany, and then you kind of like, it's possible to me, in my eyes anyways, to kind of like produce intuitions through conditioning, through grooming, maybe, cultural grooming or conditioning that will then modify those intuitions. I think that those are aberrant cases. Right. But I do think it's possible to do
or place the intuitions onto an improper set of actual facts of the matter, right? So you might still have the intuition, I should treat my neighbor as myself.
Correct.
But Jewish people are not my neighbor, and in fact, my culture has taught me that they're actually not even fully human, right? So you share the intuition, you share that deep sort of moral principle, but you have an exceedingly poor application because you've been duped into a wrong set of moral facts, right?
Yes.
And I think that's interesting in debates of both slavery and abortion. I mean, what are so many of the moves involved? Were they a move trying to deperson actual people? Why?
Sure.
Well, because it's really hard to remove the intuition that we should harm people, right? So let's just try and obscure the facts, right? Or I don't want to say, load the debate. Maybe they genuinely believe that the facts are that these aren't people, right? I certainly believe they are, right? But I just want to make the point is I wouldn't be so quick to say that the intuition isn't there, that there actually just confusion about what the actual facts of the matter are. That the principle would apply to, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, exactly. I guess going back to intuitions, it seems like this intellectual seeming, like we're saying, and so like you're saying there too, those intuitions could either be modified in a way where you're conjoining with wrong empirical facts, or you're kind of using propaganda to dehumanize people and call them like parasites, like they did the Nazis did to Jews, or as pro-abortion is doing to fetuses. It's interesting the parallel there, but so I do think that intuitions can then be modified in some way. So then you might say, well, then how do I know then, whether I can trust my intuitions or not then? And so here I would simply say that, usually we use reason to then do an analysis of our intuition. Say, is it coinciding with our common sense, the datum, the common experience that we have as human beings? And then we can say, okay, is it consistent? Like we're saying here, okay, is this a human being? Say we have an intuition, like we think it's always right to do an abortion. Abortion is pro-choice. You might have that intuition, but you can then analyze that intuition in the light of reason and in the light of common sense, and then see if they naturally accord with that. Because common sense provides that raw data, it provides that raw experience that we have, and I think it's far more natural for us to take that data in at face value, for what it gives us. It really is telling us something about reality. That's a more natural interpretation. So to me, those who don't have this intuition that moral facts are there, I think they have a defective intuition. They might have the intuition to the contrary, but I think their intuition is defective insofar as, like, if we look at the common sense data, what's more natural? The more natural interpretation is to simply take it as face value, unless you have like some philosophy kind of like blurring things and confusing things. Sometimes philosophy can confuse things and blur things that should otherwise be clear to us. And I think that's what's happening with the anti-realists, is that they're simply not seeing the power of the argument, where we can see that face value, that phenomenal conservatism that Hume is talking about, but applying it to our common sense and simply saying, yeah, realism is the default interpretation, or it should be anyways, because that's how we normally operate. And so unless we have really strong reasons to not accept that, then we should accept the fact that morality is objective. It's something that is independent of our desires or feelings.
Right.
That's what the moral data gives us. So that's a complicated way. I have to go through all these things about common sense, because I think there's so much mystery there, and it still is to some extent. But I do think that philosophy is something that is supposed to expound on that common sense. It's supposed to help us refine common sense, to kind of conceptualize it more clearly. That's why reason is there as the interpretive faculty of the common sense, of what we have as data. Because if we don't do that, if we just simply try to pick and choose, again, I don't think common sense is a package deal again.
Right.
Because you're not just simply saying, oh, my perception at time 2 at this particular moment was flawed. You're saying something much more radical. You're saying the perceptive faculty itself is flawed. It's corrupted. It can't be trusted on. And in the same sense, you're saying the faculty of like our common sense, our ability to interpret this as real, is also fundamentally like corrupted too, in a radical way. I can't trust any of my senses, perhaps. I can't trust any of my moral senses. Like, it just goes to a package deal. To me, that leads to an argument ad absurdum. So if you reject, if you reject common sense about moral values, you should at least reject common sense about these other faculties as well.
Right. I actually, if people are interested, I have an article on Catholic Answers that makes that deal, that argues for the normative web. We talk about that you can't have these arbitrary breaks, right? Good. You start to break one, you're going to break the other. So I will link that in the show notes afterwards. And I think, including reason itself, that's kind of one of the key aspects here, right? Yes. There was another point I wanted to make. Oh yeah, just about the common sense. People sometimes say, well, Thomas Aquinas, he's a common sense philosopher, man of the street, and like. Yeah, that's true in light of what Gil said, that philosophy is taking that critically reflective turn to help illumine common experience. It really asks, like, hey, what is this, and what are the conditions for its possibility, right? What is being? What makes being possible? What is knowledge? What makes knowledge possible? What is morality? What makes morality possible? And I would argue a good philosophical system should be able to answer those account for that data intelligibly without eliminating it, but at the same time, I don't want to make it seem like Thomism is easy. Yes, it is a philosophy of common sense, but like the technical machinery gets really sophisticated at times in how it accounts for all this stuff too, right? So I just don't want to like give the wrong impression that it's some just like totally naive bumpkin philosophy. Right? Anybody who studied Thomism knows it gets very intricate, but at the end of the day, it gives you the foundations that secure and actually ultimately explain and make intelligible that common sense experience, right?
Correct. Yep. That's very important. So, going again with like the Morean shift argument, he basically says, my degree of confidence of that there's a bathroom in my house is the same as my belief that it is wrong to punch a helpless kid for fun. Again, that's prime facie, because again, it's like you're taking things at what its face value, what common sense is providing you as being reasonably true. And so I think it's really important to note that, because I think someone might object, an anti-realist will object further and might say something like, well, this is an empirical claim, they might say, because whether this is whether this is the view, whether moral realism is something that everybody adopts or not, that's an empirical sense. You have to do studies, you have to do psychological studies on this, and that would be one objection you'll have against the common sense. You're like, well, everybody just believes it. Well, really, do you really know that? And these studies are quite difficult, because it depends on how you frame questions, and the way you frame questions in such a way can make people lead astray from their actual views, or you could give them special cases and may actually be misleading. So it's very difficult, in some way, to maybe perhaps do an empirical study of what people's actual beliefs are. So, but my position would not be reliant on that necessarily, about whether people instinctively, the vast majority of people instinctively take this for granted or not. I think they do. I think the moral datum shows this, but even if they didn't, even if I didn't quite have this access to people's minds, or the vast majority, I would still say we can still agree to common sense, or the common datum is still there. And the most natural interpretation is a realist interpretation That's the most naturalist. So that gives the case already for a naturalist view, regardless of how many people, whether we can study this empirically or not. We don't have to do that work in order to make these claims or justify our claims. So yeah, that'd be something I want to make about that. Because they might say, like, common sense or intuitions, that is, our intuitions are indeterminate in some way. So when we ask more sophisticated questions, because the typical layperson is just not informed of these terminological differences there, between metaethics that we're just explaining there. So I think that's important too. But yeah, so I'm pretty convinced that that the common sense is quite the most natural position, it's a normative position. So that's the first argument. That took a little while, and I know I'm not sure how much time you have. We've already been doing this for 2 hours, dang. But I can maybe kind of brush this up a little bit, kind of go a little faster here, so we can kind of get to the second argument, which I really like as well, which you alluded to as well. It's basically a kind of like a companions and guilt argument.
That's right.
It's arguing from epistemic facts to the fact that there are moral norms because they have the same kind of structure, the same kind of like nature to them. So basically the idea is if epistemic realism is true, then moral realism is true. First premise. So second premise would be epistemic moral realism is true. So it's like third premise is therefore moral realism is true. So we're alluding to this. What is epistemic realism? Well, the epistemic realism, or epistemic norms is probably a better way to put it, is that there are certain epistemic facts that we ought to obey. We ought to be logical. We ought to believe on the basis of evidence. We ought to be reasonable or try to follow the evidence wherever it leads. We should go to favor the hypothesis that's more reasonable or more plausible, regardless of whether we want it to be true or not. It's not, and we also think we ought not to believe on the basis of flipping a coin. That's a very flimsy basis on which to believe in something. That doesn't provide justification. So these are like epistemic norms that we all take for granted in any kind of rational discourse, it seems to me. You ought to reason this way regardless of whether you feel that way. And so moral norms are very much comparable to that. They're basically parallel. They're companions of guilt. So if you reject moral norms, you have to also likewise reject epistemic norms. And to me, that's just an extremely high cost. It just leads to absolute absurdity to me. If you're willing to reject both in order to stay consistent, which is what I think you should do. But if you do so, it just leads to absolute absurdity. You can't have
certainly leads to you lose any possible arguments you could give for your position at that point, right?
Yeah. And it just flies so flatly in the face of any of our common experience, and our common sense that we just I just can't even find that fathomable to accept. So I find that argument quite persuasive. There are those who try to push back on that and take like some kind of error theory or whatever view of our epistemic norms, but I just find them so contrived, so ad hoc.
Right.
And sometimes I have little tolerance for philosophers because of their ability to argue incessantly for absurd positions and then make it more complicated. And you feel like, oh man, I got to argue for all this. And it's fun as an intellectual game for me, as an intellectual exercise. It's fun to be able to look at these ideas. But then when you realize, well, this is the fact that people are taking this seriously is just so absurd.
Yeah, you would need a highly, highly, highly contrived paradigm to try and shore up these epistemic norms while eschewing and eliminating the other moral norms. I just find it too implausible to even take seriously. If people, however, if they want to go deeper into this, a really great book on this, and Gil, maybe you've read this one, is called The Normative Web, An Argument for Moral Realism by Terence Cuneo. That's literally just a book-like treatment of this type of commitment, right? If you're committed to epistemic norms, which he defends, they exist, then you should be a committed moral realist as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Now, the other one I wanted to get into, just because I just find it so fascinating. So that's an argument, the modal and ontological argument by Michael Huemer and Christian Kunz. They kind of give a modal ontological argument similar to the ontological argument for God's existence, except this case it's for morality. And I think it avoids some of the problems that ontological arguments for God's existence may have, in my opinion, which I think is quite interesting. So I'm not going to go into too much depth on this, but I just want to make sure you guys know that it's out there. So first premise will be some objective moral facts are such that if they're true, they're necessarily true. So it is possible that at least some of these putative objective moral truths are true. So at least one of these putative objective moral truths is necessarily true. If at least one of these putative objective moral truths is necessarily true, then at least one of these objective moral truths is actually true. Therefore, at least one of these putative objective moral truths is actually true. That is, moral realism is true. So the basic idea is that it seems as if it's possible for something like, say, it's always wrong to torture a baby for fun, say, if that's even possibly true, then it's going to be necessarily true. It's not going to depend on some of the world where, yeah, that could be true in some other possible or some other time or circumstance. So as long as it's possibly true, then it's necessarily true. And that seems like be providing a given case, because it looks like, at least for some anti-realists will concede, like, yeah, it seems like it's at least possible that these things are true. They're not going to say it's impossible, or it's like intrinsically incoherent or absurd. They're usually going to grant that premise. So if they grant that premise, it seems to lead to, well, then it must be necessarily true. I just find that argument really
yeah, that's funny. And then the modal machinery kicks in and gives you that conclusion, right? So that is a valid argument. I just imagine that the skeptic will just press back against that possibility premise in the same way that they press back against it in the one for God, right? Yeah. Right. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I'm just saying that that's my guess is that's exactly the tack. They'll be skeptical about that first step, right?
Yeah, and it's true, but I think one of the advantages of this argument is that it's no one's appealing to like the greatest conceivable truth or anything. No one's appealing to that greatest conceivable notion. So the parodies that would happen to the ontological arguments would, for God's existence, I don't think it would work for this moral argument. And it seems like it's a lot more plausible in a sense that all we're just simply saying it, these moral truths seem possibly true, that they're possibly true.
They have to be necessary moral truths, right?
Right. And the only way in which I can see them trying to argue that is to simply say that they deny that it's possible. They'd have to deny it. And it seems like that leads to even greater absurdities. That's the most natural way to argue it, I think. And you could try to have your cake and eat it too, but I think it becomes more and more contrived as you try to do so.
That's a new one for me, Gil. That's interesting. I have not seen that one. Does Humor have a paper on that? That's
yes, he does.
Okay, I'll have to go read that. I'm not familiar with that one, so that's fun. You learn something new every time you podcast. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'll be thinking about that for the rest of the day now. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like it. I think it's a really interesting argument.
That's cool.
So yeah,
I also love when philosophers do like little creative things like that. Hey, let's take Flanagan's argument. And let's just try and dump moral realism out of it, right?
Yeah. It's genius. Yeah, I love it too. I love it.
Yeah, points for cleverness, to be sure, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It really elevates my credence and belief in moral realism. Once I read that, I was like, yeah, that makes total sense. They're necessarily true as a supervenient thesis. If it's possible, they're necessarily true. And we're not talking about any greatest conceivable anything. There's no appeal to something in existence in the mind versus existence in reality. We're not saying it's greater to exist in reality than it is to exist in the mind. There's nothing like that going on there, So I think it really is quite interesting. And so in order to reject it, I think it leads to quite some absurdities, in my opinion. So yeah, so that's another argument. So the last argument, which I think is probably the most important argument, would be the Thomistic argument, the argument from metaphysics. Now it's hard to really kind of I suppose give a thorough, fair view of this, just because it's so dependent on us being able to do metaphysics properly, because we need to do the metaphysics in order to understand all the concepts, again, like I was saying here. But let me just go through the premises here, just kind of give you a rough idea.
And let me just emphasize what you just said. This is so important, not just for Thomism, but for understanding other paradigms and the consequences of those paradigms. Somebody asked me recently, it's a question I get frequently, is, hey, what is your favorite argument for God? And I insist, I don't have a favorite argument for God, right? What I have is a metaphysical system that I think is definitely true, that just ineluctably leads to God's existence, right? And it's me becoming convinced of that system and working out the consequences of those commitments that really is what causes me to be a classical theist. Yes, I still like Alex Proust's contingency argument. It's very nice, right? But but ultimately, it's the system and the consequences thereof, right? And you're saying the same thing with morality here. It's hard to kind of give a nutshell argument that's going to convince people, but if you really take the time to move into this metaphysical system, and I'll borrow from Alistair McIntyre, great ethicist, right? And he'll say, if you want to really evaluate paradigms, you actually have to try and enter into that paradigm and look through that paradigm and try and make predictions through it, and then compare it to other paradigms. You have to really learn to shift through paradigms and try and really live in a paradigm for a while to truly understand it. And that's just trying to be I would say a responsible philosopher, right?
Yeah.
And then seeing if some paradigms can predict failures of other paradigms, and if so, what does that tell you about this paradigm? If it can predict, and he ultimately makes arguments for Aristotelianism, right? Right, doing this,
Yeah.
and I think that's right. So I want to say what Gil's going to say is, I'm sure, going to be exceedingly good. But if you really want to appreciate it, I can tell you, even if you're not convinced of Gil's conclusion here, just go and try and just look through the paradigm and live in that paradigm for a while and see if it illumines anything for you. Yeah, I just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, so let's get into that. Let's delve into it. So I think it's pretty simple in its argument, in its form. So the first premise is, if there are rational agents with natural goods, then moral goods exist, right? There are rational agents with natural goods, so therefore moral goods exist. Now, I think we have to kind of unpack a little bit by what we mean by a natural good. And I think a natural good is simply a good that is determined by what fulfills that thing's nature. You know, what is that thing's nature, which it is. Like, for example, it's good for a hamster to eat and burrow, to be a nocturnal animal, to run around, you know. And so it would be bad then for a hamster to simply eat toothpaste and maybe crackers or something. That would be very bad for the hamster. So we're talking about natural goods here, just to be clear on that. I'm not talking about moral goods just yet. There's a distinction between moral goods and natural goods. But these are goods that you have by virtue of your nature. That you, for example, a human, by virtue of being a human, you should have eyesight, right? That should be something that's there. Whenever a doctor makes a medical evaluation about, say, your heart, and you have certain irregular palpitations, say, in your heart, they're able to say that that's not normal, that's not good for you, and it's actually dangerous, and we need to maybe do a surgery to restore that to its proper functioning. We believe there's certain proper functioning to human beings, proper functioning of eyes, proper functioning of, it's not proper that we have cancer. That's not proper to our natures. And anyone who kind of suggests that seems to be suggesting an absurdity to me, that it's proper to us to have cancer. It's proper to us to have all kinds of defects, say, like being blind or not being able to speak. It's proper that,
or being ignorant.
Yeah, or being ignorant. Yeah, that's not proper to us. It's proper to our nature. It's good for our nature, our intellect, such that it should be able to understand things, to know the truth about reality, to know how things are. That's good for the intellect by its nature. So we know.
Sorry, just taking a sip of Clorox here.
Okay. Oh man, sorry. But if you were taking one, you're about to die. So
this is it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's obviously not good. It's like drinking Clorox or something. There's something that just seems so common sense and so natural to all the medical fields and to our everyday human experience that we do believe in natural goods. We do believe that there are natural goods. So if there are natural goods, then I think moral goods do exist, right? And so let me just define moral good. Moral goods, just by contrast, is just what it refers to, like, good that a rational agent ought to will for oneself and others. And so that's just what it is. It's like, what's happening here is that since we're creatures that have a reason and a will, we're able to then assess what is our natural good. We're able to reason through it, are able to understand, hey, this is my nature. These are the purposes by which my nature is supposed to operate, or how it's supposed to function. And I can discover that through reason, through the sciences, through reflection of myself and others. And then I'm able to assess, okay, this is what's good for me. It's good for me to eat chicken. It's not good for me to eat, to drink Clorox, right? I'm able to assess that. And so these natural goods kind of impose kind of an obligation, an oughtness to us. So for the Thomist, it's very important to note this, but the Thomist believes oughtness is built into the very structure of the world. There is no is to ought gap, as Hume maybe have ejected the is ought Hume fallacy, because at the rock bottom, there just are essences, things that which have a certain way in which they should be, certain kinds of things, you might say.
Natural appetites, yeah.
Natural appetites, yeah. These natural desires that we have. And that these natural ends that we have in mind as well. And so it seems to me that when we have these like natural goods, that moral goods flow naturally. That it just comes with the package deal, because really what a moral good is just a special instance of a natural good. Maybe it might be a higher instance, but it's still a special instance of a natural good.
Right. It pertains to rational animals, because morality is really a rational enterprise, right?
Yeah.
And there's not some huge gap really, I mean, it is just the same theory of goodness up through the hierarchy of being into the realm of rationality, right? For Thomists.
Yes.
And you brought up the Islamic gap. That's important because, I mean, that's one of the big objections, right? But again, that's only going to be relevant to a particular impoverished metaphysics, right? For Thomists, I mean, let's use the Kantian language, right? We can take the hypothetical, like, if you want to be happy, then you should follow the dictates of natural law, those facts about human nature, right, that tell us what is really good for us. Well, we can close the hypothetical into a categorical by just self-evidence that we all want to be happy, right? That's what we all seek our own fulfillment, right? Even the person in despair who, God forbid, is contemplating suicide thinks they will be better off dead, right? So for the Thomist, having that essentialist underpinning, right, allows us to ground that normativity and move from the hypothetical to the categorical to kind of like blend systems here, Thomism and Kant, right? Yeah, and close the alleged Islamic gap.
Yeah, and that's actually super important because an anti-realist that I know, and I really enjoyed discussing things with him, Lance Bush, he'd be like, what you just said there, because he'd be like, well, what are normative reasons? He thinks categorical norms are absurd because on reflection, it seems to him when categorical norms are asking you to do is to obey something, irrespective of any motivation or appetite you may have. And to basically appetites and motivation don't even come to the calculus of your decision making. They don't even come to the calculus of what you should moral experience, perhaps. And so he thinks that's unintelligible because we always operate on the basis of passions. That's what I was talking about Hume earlier. Hume thinks like we always operate on the basis of passion. I think his views are kind of wrong, but I do think there's some truth to that, though. I do think that the appetites are very central. So we're not getting rid of the appetites. We're simply putting the appetites in their proper domain, in the proper perspective, proper ordering of those appetites. And that those appetites will motivate us. We're not asking you to be some kind of disinterested Spockian being, simply wills the good, without any appeal to any of the appetites, right? And it seems that would be absurd, in fact, because without appetites, how can you even act? How can you take action on things? You can't do anything because you're just immobilized. You don't have any motivation to do anything. So appetites are super crucial in a Thomistic worldview. And we don't take this, I guess, modern way of thinking about categorical norms, at least some ways.
Right. And it's important, propositions can be assumed, they can be evident in themselves, or they can be evident through something previous, right? And a Thomist is just going to say, look, it's evident, self-evident, right, that we're all driven towards our own happiness. That is universal, right? And that's what gives the categorical force, if we want to use Kantian language, to the prior hypothetical of you ought to follow the dictates of the natural law, say, meaning you should want what is really good for you. What is really good for you is what accords with right desire, which is what completes you, perfects you, actualizes you in the relevant potencies according to your essence, right?
Correct. Yeah, and that's exactly it. So, like, going back to the argument again, that ties in natural because what is, you might say, well, a moral good is again a special instance of the natural good, but in particular, it's the natural good of an intellect and a will. So that's what it's being applied to. So you have to ask the question, what is the intellect's natural good? Well, the intellect's natural good is to know what is true and good. It's to understand, to know and understand things. That's the intellect's natural good. And if you say something contrary, well, then that intellect's purpose is to know what's false. Well, then is that true? You're kind of like self-refuting, I think.
Right. And not only that, and this goes to show how deep normativity is, right? But if you say that reason isn't naturally oriented towards truth, then you lose any possibility of evaluating arguments, right? You can't say something is a good argument or a bad argument unless you're already committed towards that sort of natural directness, normativity, teleology of the rational agent, reason, intellect, all of that, right? So I think when you try to push these denials all the way down, they do sort of implode ultimately, eventually.
They absolutely do. Yeah, and it just leads to an absurdity of a life, a cognitive dissonance, if you just can't live consistently in light of that.
Right. You're going to be in what, as Aristotle said, like keep pushing the skepticism. Like the most you'll be able to do at some point is just like wiggle your finger and like.
It's accurate. Yeah. That's all you can do. So, and that's why it's so important when we're reasoning truly. And I think fairly about what things are and not trying to look at some contrived explanation to get away from what is immediately obvious. That's to me what is the issue here. Ultimately, it stems down to like, I'm not going to interpret my perception of a squirrel right now in a natural way possible. I'm going to interpret all my experiences of all perception as just a hologram or some demon perceiving things. And it goes extremely contrived. And every single time we do that to any kind of faculty, whether it's the moral faculty, the perceptive faculty, the intellectual rational faculty, it leads to disaster, because you're not just talking about individual instances of failure. You're talking about the failure of faculties altogether in itself. And that leads to disaster in terms of knowledge and communication, ability to even have rational discourse. And then that's quite damning for the more anti-realist, in my opinion. And yeah.
Yeah, really good. I don't know what your experience has been in this, Gil, but certainly mine has been, when just talking like to everyday people, right, is like, not only are most of them definitely more realists, especially the ones who haven't taken like philosophically critical turns and stuff like that, right? But most people want to be more realists, right?
Yes.
So what I find is not that you like have to make a strong case for moral realism. You just have to, and this was my experience in literally my first ethics class, Gil. My professor was a strong form moral relativist. Like they exist and they're out there. Now people should know, at least the surveys I've seen, is most ethicists are moral realists. They're not anti-realists. They are moral realists. But my first professor was a strong form moral relativist, and so of course we got into it a bunch. But I found like most of the students in the class liked me and agreed with my position. And like maybe it was because the arguments are better, but also like they want that to be the case, right? They want it. They want to be able to say, yeah, it is really wrong, right? And so did my professor. Like my professor, she was one of your famous inconsistent ones, right? Because she was always quick to condemn prior generations and other cultures. So her relativism was really of the unsophisticated sort, right? So, taking back with one hand what she was putting out with the other type of deal constantly going on. But I found that like once you just cleared away, frankly, the sophistry for most people, like they want to be more realist. They're happy to be more realist. You don't have to like build out a huge metaphysical network for them. Like they really just kind of want to go with the basic common sense and interpretation of that. But unfortunately, a lot of people get caught up on a lot of the arguments that you presented, like, well, what do we do with moral disagreement and differences in taste and all this? But I've really found, again, in my experience, that just making these distinctions and showing that these actually aren't good objections, like the naturalistic fallacy is all gap. Like most people don't even need to hear much more of a substantial case from that. They're like, okay, barriers are gone. I'm just going to keep going on. Is that, have you found that to be the case too? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Because I think the problem is I just don't see a good metaphysical theory to explain more facts. And so when they're coming at it from there, they're like, oh, okay, I guess these things are too weird. We can't really explain them. So let's just get rid of them. And there almost seems to be little to no good attempt at explaining them. It's just like, okay, if you take a non-naturalist view of moral realism, like what the heck is that? I mean, maybe you could explain it in terms of some rational relations or something, but it still seems quite strange that they even have any attachment to our natural world, and if it is a natural world, that also seems quite strange. Like, what do you mean? The natural doesn't have any, it doesn't have oughtness in the world. It's just, there's just what things that is. It's the case that animals kill each other all the time. And so you just have the way that the world is, but that doesn't get you to how the world ought to be. And there doesn't seem to be any oughtness built in the world. But if you take, like, even Nagel realizes this, he's not even a Christian, he's not a theist, and he realizes that there has to be this oughtness, this Aristotelian return to philosophy about teleology, natural causes. And so I think that's very crucial, is that people a lot of times are coming from this devoid worldview, and I can sympathize with them, because they're like, okay, I don't see any other alternative here, so I guess I just got to get rid of my moral realist beliefs because they don't seem sensible. I got to follow the evidence where it leads.
Or you get rid of the theory, right? If you got a piece of data and it's stubborn and your theory can't accommodate it, you can try to eliminate or replace the data, which I would say, unfortunately, a number of people do, or you can reevaluate the background paradigm and the theory, right? Which is what I did, right? From a naturalistic perspective,
Yeah. And I think it's just so powerful, just to go back to the more anti-realist, like Lance Bush might make, counterexample to intuition, you might say. He supposes, again, the alien race, I think he calls them Zorpians, makes the intuitionist case for their moral values being objectively true as we do. Except they evolved to be a warrior society where it's good to kill off your rival, always crush your enemies thoroughly, and desire vengeance. That's their intuition. So how do you determine that? Who is right? Because it's just intuition in this case. Well, in this, I think Thomism provides a very powerful case because, if, say, you're eliminating another tribe or another alien race, well, you have to ask the question, do they have the intellect? Do they have the will? So then it doesn't matter whether your intuition is of this sort that you have to eliminate them. You can always analyze to reason and analyze your nature and their natures and say, is that something good? Did we share metaphysically the same nature? We may have like certain physiological differences per se, perhaps, but we metaphysically share the same nature of having intellect and will. We're still rational agents. We're still rational beings. And so it's immoral and wrong to act contrary to their good. And I know that that's their good. And I'm actually acting contrary to my good, regardless of whether I intuitively feel that way or not. And so I do think Thomism provides an excellent intuition stalemate stopper, I guess. It eliminates the stalemates because you could then appeal to nature and reason.
I agree with that. But of course, we have no examples, anything with those intuitions. And the Thomists would even go further and say, like, what if somebody had the intuition of an intellectual being that they should believe false things? So we just say that's impossible, right? It's just never going to happen,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I think intuition is just an instinctive, natural interpretation of common sense. It's unless you believe in some absurd universe, a worldview where everything is the opposing thing, and you believe in contradictions or what have you, where you're led to believe in false things, and you can't even trust your rational faculties to even reason things. You might say, I believe that moral realism is true because X and Y reasons, but in reality, your real reasoning was because banana, therefore more anti-realism.
Perfect,
that could be a
perfect
real,
deduction. Yep.
Yeah, perfectly logical. It could be that way. If you think the world is so fundamentally unintelligible, that leads to so much unintelligible claims. I don't even know if I have to take your claims seriously at that point because it's just nonsense.
Yeah.
So I think that's what this ultimately reduces to, is this nonsense. And so, that would be something I'd point out there.
Cool deal, man. Hey, so we've been going for 2.5 hours. It's always great jamming with you. Is there anything else you want to get out there, reiterate? I mean, we can always do a follow-up, man. I'd love to have you back on if we want to do an extension of this. Maybe do some Q&A next time or something. Any summary thoughts, concluding thoughts, and make sure you plug some of your work that you're doing as well so people can keep up with you.
So concluding thoughts, I would just simply say, we do got to take their arguments with seriously. I do think we should, but I do think ultimately this reduces, if you're reasoning correctly, we can see that it goes contrary to common sense. And we should remain in common sense because those are our most fundamental beliefs. We should refer to our most fundamental beliefs. When there are conflicts of beliefs here, like you were saying, I realize, I can't explain moral realism. Maybe I should give up something else. Maybe I should give up my naturalistic worldview, or atheistic worldview, or maybe I should give up something else. If there's something else if it's contradicting your most fundamental common sense views, it's probably that philosophical system that's wrong, that you should reject because it's contradicting those common sense intuition or common data you experience. So I would encourage everybody to kind of just go and look at Thomas Aquinas, look at natural law, or look at David Oderberg's book on this, The Good. He talks about all these things and real essentialism. If you don't believe in natural kinds or natural goods and you want to reject that.
His latest, The Metaphysics of Good and Evil, is also quite magisterial.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's perfect for this kind of discussion. And we need to be able to analyze these things from a metaphysical perspective. And that's what's lost in the debate, is that we've lost this metaphysical system that makes sense of moral values. And so when we do that, I think we kind of come to a very beautiful systemized view of reality that preserves common sense. And that should be our goal. Now, not all interpretations that we have of our common sense are accurate. That's why we reflect again. We use our reason, our rational faculty to then make sure that it's consistent with common sense. Our intuitions are consistent. And I think our intuition is not going to do that. And they're not going to contradict our common sense. But there are times, again, when I think someone's intuition can be conditioned by culture, And so we need to be careful of that. We need to use our reason, compare ourselves to natural goods, and compare ourselves to common sense, and that provides a case. So if you want to follow my work, I have a blog. It's Thomistic.thinker.com. So you can kind of go on there, and I have some arguments there that I'm kind of developing. So I'll try to be more active. Lately, I've just been so busy with IT and work and life and finding a girl And so it's this like, once I get that all settled down, I really want to get back into YouTube more. So
awesome, man. Well, you're always welcome on this channel. Appreciate you coming on. This was a marathon of a session, and always lots of more stuff that we could cover. But hey, that just gives us an excuse to do this again soon. So Gil, thank you so much. I'll be sure to link the resources, as many as I can remember anyways, in the comments afterwards. So hey, people, if you like this stuff, whether you agree or you disagree, if you just like these deeper philosophical conversations, help us out. Please like it. Please subscribe. Ring that little bell. Share it. We'd really appreciate it. And we'll catch you guys on the next episode.